Mereka ada ini. Ah, ini kan. Ini semua kamu. Kamu ya deh. Iya. Itulah hidup. Suaranya mana? Tanya. Panas ya, basah.
Iya siap. Oh, iya. Halo, Assalamualaikum. Assalamualaikum, Prof. Bambang. Assalamualaikum, Prof. Selamat pagi.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Sehat, Prof?
Sehat-sehat, alhamdulillah.
Alhamdulillah. Makasih, Prof, atas kesempatan waktunya, Prof. Ikut kegiatan kami,
Terima
Prof.
kasih sudah mengundang dan terima kasih atas kepercayaannya.
Hi, Steve.
Good morning. Nice to
Steve,
meet you.
morning.
Good morning. Nice to meet you all.
Greetings from Makassar. How are you doing?
Yeah, I'm well, thank you. I hope everyone's okay this morning.
Yeah. Sorry for the late. A bit late. We start the webinar. We still wait a little bit. Maybe in about 1 or 2 minutes.
Sure, no problem. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us in this meeting. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Test. Sudah misalnya meeting. The honorable all speakers today, Mr. Stephen Francis Barn, PhD, and Mr. Professor Dr. Bambang Purwanto, MKS. The honorable the Dean of Faculty of Sports Science and Health, Universitas Negeri Makassar, Mrs. Professor Dr. Haja Hasmiati, MKes. The honorable moderator today from Faculty of Sports Science and Health, Universitas Negeri Makassar, Mr. Bustang, MSc, PhD. And the honorable all participants and all committee, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. And good morning for all. First of all, let us say to thanks to God Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala because of His permission and blessing, we can meet here in an event, international webinar in Sport Science Series 2 with the theme Sport Nutrition for Health and Performance. My name is Muhammad Reza, SPCMA, become the Master of Ceremony for this webinar. Well, let me introduce all speakers today. The first is Mr. Stephen Francis Barn, PhD, from Associate Professor in Exercise Physiology, Nanyang Technology University, Singapore. Hello, Mr. Stephen. How are you?
Oh, good morning. Nice
Good
to be
morning.
here. Thank you for inviting me.
You're welcome. Thank you for joining us today. And second speaker is Mr. Professor Dr. Bambang Purwanto, MKes, as a professor in exercise physiology, Airlangga University, Indonesia. Halo Prof. Bambang. Assalamualaikum Prof. Bambang. Semoga dalam keadaan sehat walafiat. Terima kasih sudah bergabung di webinar kami. Thanks for coming in our webinar today. And let me introduce for moderator today. His name is Mr. Bustang, MSc PhD from Department of Sport Science, Faculty of Sport Science and Health, Universitas Negeri Makassar. The honorable participants, let we move on to the next session. The next session is opening remarks. While opening this international webinar by the Dean of Faculty of Sport Science and Health, Universitas Negeri Makassar, Mrs. Profesor Dr. Hajah Hasmiati, MKes. Para peserta webinar yang kami hormati, selanjutnya kami akan memberikan kesempatan kepada Dekan Fakultas Ilmu Keolahragaan dan Kesehatan Universitas Negeri Makassar untuk memberikan sambutan sekaligus membuka kegiatan webinar internasional kita pada pagi hari ini. Dengan ini kami persilakan.
Mr. Reza. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi ta'ala wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam.
Selamat pagi, salam sejahtera buat kita semua. Pertama-tama marilah kita memanjatkan puji syukur kehadirat Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala karena atas rahmat dan hidayahnya sehingga kita dapat bertemu walaupun tidak secara langsung pada pagi hari ini, semua atas nikmat yang diberikan oleh Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala sehingga kita bisa melaksanakan webinar pada pagi hari ini. Selanjutnya perkenankan saya menyampaikan penghargaan dan ucapan terima kasih kepada Ketua Panitia beserta seluruh jajaran kepanitiaan internasional webinar ini yang telah mempersiapkan terselenggaranya acara pada hari ini. Hal ini sangat penting untuk saya sampaikan mengingat Fakultas Ilmu Keolahragaan dan Kesehatan Universitas Negeri Makassar sedang giat meningkatkan kerjasama dengan universitas ternama di luar negeri menuju world class university. Secara khusus, perkenankan saya menyampaikan rasa terima kasih dan penghargaan yang setinggi-tingginya kepada Bapak Stephen Burst dan kepada Bapak Profesor Dr. Bambang Purwanto MKes sebagai pembicara pada webinar ini, dan terima kasih yang telah meluangkan waktunya. Kami semua tahu bahwa kedua pembicara punya jadwal yang sangat padat, tetapi dengan memberikan waktu kepada kami dapat menjadi pembicara pada webinar ini. Jadi terima kasih yang sebanyaknya Prof atas kesempatan yang waktu yang diberikan kepada kami untuk menjadi memberikan narasumber kepada kami semuanya. Kegiatan internasional webinar ini mengusung tema Sport Nutrition for Health and Performance. Diharapkan dapat menambah wawasan dan pengetahuan para dosen, mahasiswa, dan praktisi olahraga terkait perkembangan ilmu keolahragaan dan nutrisi olahraga pada saat ini. Saya mungkin tidak perlu berpanjang lebar, saya cuma mengharapkan kepada semua teman yang mengikuti webinar ini, kita akan betul-betul menyimak kedua pembicara sehingga dapat mengembangkan apa yang pembicara berikan kepada kita sehingga webinar ini bermanfaat untuk semua. Akhirnya saya mengucapkan terima kasih sekali lagi dan mohon maaf jika dalam kesempatan ini ada sesuatu yang tidak berkenan, itu adalah berasal dari kami. Dan saya juga mengucapkan semua pihak yang telah bekerja keras menyelenggarakan kegiatan ini serta penghargaan setinggi-tingginya kembali lagi pada kedua pembicara. Wabillahi taufiq wal hidayah. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi taala wabarakatuh. Salam olahraga.
Salam. Baik, thank you very much for Mrs. Professor Dr. Hajah Hasmiati MKes for the opening remarks and had opened this webinar. I hope this international webinar can be well until the session. Okay, the next session is webinar session, and to guide the next session, I give it's time for the Mr. Bustan to guide the next session to join in this webinar. Okay, for Mr. Bustang, time is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Pak Reza, for leading the starting of the webinar. Sorry. So we're going to start the first session of this webinar, and I'm honored to have a chance to lead this session. So we're going to have a presentation from Associate Professor Stephen Francis Burns from National Institute of Education, Nanyang Technological University. So before I let Professor Burns to deliver his keynote, let me read a little bit about a short CV of him. Dr. Stephen Burns hold a PhD in exercise physiology from Loughborough University, UK. He taught and researched at University of Texas at El Paso in the US for 1 year before going to complete postdoctoral studies in China and obesity and insulin resistance at Children's Hospital of Pittsburgh. He National Institute of Education in July 2009. He's a member of the American College of Sports Medicine. He serves as an associate editor for the Journal of Exercise Science and Fitness, as a member of the editorial board for the International Journal of Obesity and the International Journal of Sports Nutrition and Exercise Metabolism, and as a reviewer editor for Frontiers in Nutrition and for Frontiers in Sports and Active Living. Professor Burns have many publications, both in a leading journal in the field, and also has delivered many keynotes in conferences and other academic meetings. We are honored to have him here in our webinar. I haven't met him personally face to face, but Professor Burns accepted our invitation to be a keynote speaker for this webinar. We are really appreciate your willingness and kindness, Professor Burns, to share your knowledge, your work, your research with us. We are hoping that through this webinar, we could start further collaboration between the two universities, between our universities, UNM and Nanyang Technological University, particularly in terms of research collaboration, or perhaps we could do students and staff exchange in the next upcoming years. We're really looking forward to it. After the webinar, we are hoping that we could further our collaboration. I'm hoping that on behalf of the organizing committee, and also the faculty of sports science and health, we are hoping that through this webinar, participants, especially students and lecturers, could expand their knowledge and insights about the advances and issues in sports science, especially in exercise physiology. Without further ado, I cordially invite our first keynote speaker, Associate Professor Stephen Francis Burns, to deliver his presentation. Please, Professor Burns.
Good morning. Thank you so much for that kind introduction, Professor Bustang. I'm very pleased to be here. Thank you so much to the Dean, the faculty and the students at the Faculty of Sports Science and Health at the universities Negeri Makassar, if I've said that correctly. I apologize.
Perfect.
I haven't said it very well.
That's perfect.
The invitation came a bit out of the blue a few weeks ago, so I was a bit surprised, and I'm amazed at how many individuals have turned out this morning. I wasn't expecting it to be quite so large, so thank you all for giving up your Saturday morning to come and listen to what I have to share. I hope it will be of use to you. Can I just check if I've been made co-host? Yeah, it looks like it.
Yes, you are. You are your co-host now.
Okay, and can I check that you can see my slides?
Yes, it's coming. Yes, it works.
Okay, wonderful.
Yeah,
thank you
perfect.
so much. Okay, as I was kindly introduced, I am from the Physical Education and Sports Science Department at which is located within the National Institute of Education at Nanyang Technological University. When I was given my task this morning by Professor Bustang, he said that many of you are interested in breakfast. People always seem to be interested in what they eat as much as the other side of the equation, which is expending the energy from what they eat. So I'm going to share with you this morning some of the work that I've done on breakfast, both from a cognitive perspective and from a health perspective. I certainly hope it fulfills your expectations. Just before I get going, these are photos of at least our part of the university, should you ever be visiting Singapore, and I hope that you do. These are some of the areas that you may get to visit. We have wonderful sports facilities and also a wonderful group of laboratories as well. So this is what you might expect to see should you come over to Singapore. It is a scientific conference this morning, so I should declare that I have no conflicts of interest with respect to the work that I'm about to present. And I divided my talk into two parts. I am conscious of time, so if I happen to go over, I will probably just present the first part. But if I have time, I would like to share both parts with you. So the first part of this talk was on some research that we did, which was looking at breakfast and physical activity for cognition in adolescence. And I'll explain a bit of that background to you first of all. So typically, I either cycle to work, but on some days I try to take the train and the bus. And after a while, what I noticed was a picture which was pretty much like this. People get up early in Singapore, not because it's a large country and they have to travel very far, but the rail network or public transport can take some time to get from one side of the island to the other. So what you often see are people sleeping, and that includes school children like these two on the right-hand side of this picture here, who are snoozing away. And the Singaporean school day starts quite early at 7:30. So for some of these children, what that means is they're probably out of bed by 6 a.m. In some cases, even earlier. I've seen children getting onto a school bus at 5:45. So they travel long distances to reach school. And whilst I was on the train, I started to think through this, and I thought, well, I wonder if these kids have had breakfast before they left for school. You're not allowed to eat on the train or public transport in Singapore, so they're definitely not eating on the way. But I did think to myself, are they eating breakfast before they get to school, or do they eat breakfast when they get to school? And then with many of the kids, they either take public transport or they appear to get onto school buses. So then I started to think, well, how do they get to school? Does no one walk? Does no one do scoot to school? Does no one cycle to school? Because that tends to be quite common in the UK, where I'm originally from, in case you hadn't guessed yet. So part of the question is, why should children take breakfast and do physical activity in the first place? Well, if we look at the top part, breakfast, we know that individuals who consume breakfast typically have higher micronutrient intakes. They tend to have better intakes of vitamins and minerals in their diet. Overall, they tend to have better macronutrient profiles. And very often what you see is that they tend to have better body weight control and a better body mass index as well. I should say, as a caveat to this, people have challenged this. These are associations and they're not causality. So it's something to be careful of. If you ask Professor James Betts at the University of Bath in the UK, he will tell you that breakfast doesn't actually exist. In a sense, it's more of a figment of the imagination, because your first meal of the day, whether you take it early or late, is always your breakfast, right? You're breaking fast at that point. So, but nonetheless, typically when you look at the epidemiology, these are the things that you see. In terms of physical activity, what you tend to find is that people who are more physically active have better fitness, whether it's the cardiorespiratory fitness, their heart and lung fitness, or their muscular fitness. Often they tend to have better bone health as well, and maintenance of a better healthy weight. But if I was to step out into Singapore and say these things to many parents, although they may take it on board, they may not be convinced by the benefits, for example, of physical activity. But what does tend to convince Singaporean parents is when you say, actually, being physically active and taking breakfast may improve your child's performance at school. And being good Asian parents, they come awake at that because Asian parents are very interested in grades. So from that perspective, when you try to tell Asian parents, actually, these behaviors that your child engage in may be important for their cognition and their academic scores, that's how you can draw them into actually starting to undertake these behaviors. So, do children undertake these behaviors? If we look at the top study here, this is a cross-sectional study which was done. It was a HSBC study, sponsored study, which looked at breakfast consumption in children and adolescents across 41 countries. And when they looked at the prevalence of breakfast consumption, it varied greatly, from as low as 33% in Greek girls to as high as 75% in Portuguese boys. But what we see is that in none of the countries surveyed, and there was more than 190,000 children in this particular cross-sectional study, was there very high levels of breakfast consumption. There's at least 1/4 of the population to 2/3 of the population not taking breakfast. What about physical activity? Are children globally achieving physical activity levels? The bottom part of the slide here shows data in Singapore, and it shows mean daily step count. And this was again a cross-sectional study which was done in primary, secondary, and junior college, primary and secondary schools and junior colleges in Singapore. And we gave children pedometers, and we looked at the daily step count within those children. And this was done by a colleague of mine in my department. What you can clearly see is that boys tend to have higher levels of daily step count than girls overall. But across the ages, i.e. as children get older, there tends to be a decrease in step count. But the recommended levels of step counts in children is actually higher than that of adults, up to 15,000 steps per day. And in none of the levels surveyed, whether it was boys or girls, did the children achieve this, the children and adolescents. So overall, it looks as if children aren't being physically active enough. And this situation is mirrored in many countries. What about the converse? What is the evidence that breakfast consumption or physical activity can help with either academic scores or cognition? Well, the top study is from the UK, it's from Wales, and it was done in 3,000 children in grades 5 to 6. So these children were 11 to 12 years old. And they looked at standardized scores on an SAT test over 18 months in relation to consumption of breakfast items. They looked at it at baseline and they did a follow-up test as well. And what they found was actually there was a strong association between breakfast consumption and these scores on these standardized tests. The association for healthy breakfast items wasn't quite as strong. And I believe that the odds ratio did cross the median line, if you like. But nonetheless, children who consumed breakfast regularly were more likely to do better on the educational outcomes. For physical activity, we have good data. This is actually a randomized controlled trial at the bottom from the US by a very leading group. And what they did was a 9-month intervention in a school where they put some children on a physical activity program and they put the rest on a wait list. So the kids who were in the control group were on a wait list, but they got physical activity at the end of the intervention. And they looked at different indicators of basically executive function. And what they found was that the kids who got the extra physical activity across the 9-month period had better measures of executive function than those kids who didn't. So this is an inhibitory test, and it looks at mean response accuracy on that inhibitory test. And what you can see is that the kids in the intervention group, i.e. in red, did better than those kids on the wait list in blue. So this is an RCT, so it's very powerful data. So how might it be that breakfast or physical activity can help with cognitive function and potentially improving academic scores in children or adolescents? Well, let's look at breakfast first of all. When you eat breakfast and you go, or you don't eat breakfast and you go to school, if you're doing classes over that morning, obviously one of the things that happens after a while is you start to feel hungry. So if I'm a child in a class and it's 11 o'clock in the morning and I haven't eaten breakfast, my stomach begins to distract me from what the teacher is saying. So the first obvious thing that breakfast can do is that it can increase satiety in a child. And therefore, from that perspective, it helps minimize distraction in classes. The second thing that breakfast can do is to provide blood glucose. And as we know, the central nervous system works almost exclusively on glucose, and it doesn't use fat as a source of energy. Now, this may be particularly important in children whose size of their brain in relation to the rest of their body tends to be larger. In addition, children tend to have smaller livers, and they go to bed earlier. So the overnight fast tends to be longer in children than that in adults. So when they get up in the morning, providing them with a breakfast which has some glucose in may be particularly important. Components of the breakfast may be used in the synthesis of neurotransmitters, for example, noradrenaline, which affect the child's mood, motivation, their mood, or their arousal. And then finally, there may be behavioral explanations. So just by taking breakfast, you may feel more alert and motivated to have the concentration to learn. And ultimately, in most of the studies that have been done on breakfast and cognition in children, it can lead to good outcomes or improved outcomes, which are those listed on the right-hand side of this particular table, such as verbal memory, spatial memory, attention, and arithmetic. What about physical activity? Well, here again on this side, on the left-hand side, we have physical activity or exercise, which is the stimulus to the body. And on the right-hand side, we have the potential outcomes that physical activity is currently associated with: processing speed, response accuracy, and mathematical computation time. But what are the mechanisms of action via which physical activity can work? Well, again, it's involved in the synthesis of neurotransmitters such as noradrenaline and dopamine. Some people have challenged whether this is important, because if you look at the half-life of noradrenaline, for example, in the circulation, it's only about 3 minutes. But in the central nervous system, i.e. in the brain, the half-life of these neurotransmitters is much longer, actually nearer 12 hours. Exercise may stimulate parts of the brain, so it may activate or excite certain areas of your brain when you take part in it, particularly if you do exercise which involves a lot of coordination. And these parts of the brain may be responsible for mediating certain cognitive functions. And then exercise may also stimulate a protein called brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which in itself stimulates something called neurogenesis, so the growth of new neural pathways in the brain, and also neuroplasticity, which is more about how those pathways develop and the malleability of those particular pathways as well. Now, the increased concentrations of brain-derived neurotrophic factor, or BDNF for short, tend to be post-exercise and not during the exercise itself. So they may take time to increase. So what is the overall evidence looking at both of these factors? These are and how are we doing in terms of this evidence? Actually, when the US physical activity guidelines were brought out in 2018, the latest set of guidelines, they determined that there was currently insufficient evidence to determine whether a relationship exists between moderate to physical activity and cognition in children aged 14 to 18 years old. A year later, an updated report came out in Medicine and Science in Sports and Exercise, and this was another consensus statement. And they said that there was promising evidence for the positive effects of physical activity on cognition in children, which was a slight update from the US Physical Activity Guidelines report the year before. But overall, what you can see is that we still don't have strong evidence in this particular field. With respect to breakfast, a review conducted in 2016 suggested that breakfast has a short-term positive effect on certain cognitive functions 4 hours post-ingestion. And that would be great if it did that, because I'm sure most children 4 hours post-ingestion will probably be thinking about their lunch by that time. So they'd have the opportunity for another meal. So it looks certainly as if there's some evidence for breakfast, but there tend to be fewer studies in adolescents. Excuse me. What we did find when we started our studies, which I'll head into in a second, was that we wanted to look at the combined effect of physical activity and breakfast. And the reason for that was we thought, okay, we've got breakfast on one side, we've got physical activity on the other, but if we add the two together, is there some sort of additive effect or possibly synergistic effect? And we also want to know what the ideal start to the day is. It's great if your kids take breakfast. It's great if your kids walk to school, but it's even better if they take breakfast and they walk to school. And before we started our research in 2018, what we saw was that there was only one isolated study that had previously demonstrated combining breakfast with exercise. looking at cognitive outcomes in children. And what they did was they gave children either a low GI breakfast or a high GI breakfast. And then afterwards, some children got exercise, marked as EX on here, and some children got no exercise. And they found slightly different effects depending on the breakfast that the children had and the exercise that the children had. So, for example, when they looked at response times, they found that a low GI breakfast was more favorable than a high GI breakfast. So we started to do our own studies in this particular area. I've got two studies that I'd like to describe here. The first, it was a cross-sectional survey where we wanted to identify the weekday breakfast and physical activity habits of Singaporean adolescents and how these habits associated with mood. It wasn't a random survey. We approached certain schools. Unfortunately, it was based on access, but we did manage to garner 365 adolescents, 52% of which were boys. And there was an ethnic mix of those adolescents, which was generally reflective of the ethnic background in Singapore. So the majority were Chinese, about 75%, almost 15% were Singaporean Malay, and 4.4% Singapore Indian children. And you can see that range, the age range of the children there, which was from 14 to 19 years. We surveyed 5 high schools, junior colleges, or for institutes of further education. We gave the children a breakfast questionnaire. We looked at breakfast frequency, how many days per week they took it. We looked at their daily life patterns, what time they went to bed, what time they woke up. And we also gave them a physical activity questionnaire, which was based on recall from the previous 7 days, but also where they listed specific sports or physical activities. And then the final questionnaire we gave them was to look at their mood state. So something called the Positive and Negative Effects Schedule, or PANAS for short. So it has 2 subscales. One looks at positive mood states and the other one looks at negative mood states. And the children measure that on a Likert scale from 1 to 5. So what did we find out? Well, these were our initial data. Almost 61% of children consume breakfast 5 days a week, so that's not bad, just slightly under 2/3. Remember, we looked at the international data earlier, which said 33 to 75% of kids. Those kids, and most of those kids, or quite a lot of those kids, took the car to school, about 10%. Many others took public transport. But when we asked the kids about breakfast, what was important is that those kids who consumed breakfast said, yes, it's helpful, and they thought that it would give them energy, etc., etc. What we did see was that 15% of kids took no breakfast, but there was another 25% who took breakfast on 1 to 4 days a week. So they weren't consuming it every day. They were intermittent breakfast eaters. Some days they would eat, some days not. Probably what's interesting here is that when we asked the kids who didn't eat breakfast, was it helpful? Actually, 2/3 of them said yes as well. So even though they didn't eat breakfast, they realized that breakfast was probably good for them in some way or another. Now, this is the really interesting data, I think. What you can see is the time those kids went to bed. The breakfast eaters tended to go to bed slightly earlier than the non-breakfast eaters. So that may be one explanation for why they eat breakfast. They can get up earlier, they have the same amount of sleep, but because they go to bed earlier, they get up earlier and have time to consume breakfast. So you can see that more of them are waking up early compared with the no breakfast eaters. But what you see is the chart on the bottom left-hand side of this particular slide, and it looks at negative mood scores. So we didn't see any difference in positive mood scores among the three groups, the breakfast eaters, no breakfast eaters, and irregular breakfast eaters. But what we did see was that the irregular breakfast eaters had higher negative mood scores. And we found this interesting. So there was no difference between the kids who ate breakfast and didn't have breakfast ever. So it suggests if you don't eat breakfast on a regular basis, it doesn't affect your mood. You get used to it, if you like. But those kids who only ate breakfast intermittently, when they didn't eat breakfast, they got irritated. And so they go into school, and because they're used to breakfast on some days, when they don't eat it, they go into school in a more negative state. And therefore, it could potentially affect their academic outcomes. These are the physical activity data. About 65% of the youth, so almost 2/3, reported insufficient moderate to physical activity each day. And we classified that based on the international classification of 60 minutes per day. The mean moderate to physical activity reported each day was about 51%. And 8.5% of youth reported no moderate to physical activity per each day. So in terms of physical activity, we weren't doing great. But what was interesting was that kids who were more active tended to have a more positive mood score when they entered school. So there's no difference in negative mood score, but if you're regularly active, you feel more positive going into school. So we found that interesting. So our conclusions from that first study, about 38% of youth never or regularly consume breakfast. A lack of time and not feeling like eating were the most common reasons they cited for not eating breakfast. Irregular breakfast eaters enter school in a more irritable state than those youth who eat breakfast regularly. Almost 2/3 of Singaporean youth are completing insufficient amounts of physical activity for health, and therefore that could probably affect their academic and cognitive benefits as well. And lower amounts of physical activity affect the positive mood score at the start of the morning. So probably the best thing here is for people to eat breakfast regularly and to be active on the way to school. So the second part of this study, which we received funding for, was to examine the combined effects of breakfast intake and exercise on short-term academic and cognitive performance in kids in junior college and high school. And this was a laboratory-based study that we did. It was a randomized study, it had a control group, and it was done in a parallel arm study design. So we recruited children 14 to 19 years from high school or junior college. We had asked that all of those children had a normal body mass index for age and sex as defined by the Singapore Health Promotion Board. They weren't allowed to have any diagnosed learning or attention disorders, free of any eating disorders or diabetes. They weren't dieting at that time or fasting for personal or religious beliefs. They weren't performing excessive exercise training, so we didn't want top athletes coming in. And because one of the tests involved colour, that they weren't allowed to be colourblind as well either. So we randomised those children into 4 different groups. The first one was a group which was fasted and sedentary for the morning. The second group of children, we gave them breakfast, but they had to be physically inactive for the morning, so sedentary. The third group was fasted, but we made them do some physical activity that morning. And the fourth group were the lucky group. We gave them both breakfast and they got to do some exercise as well. And you can see some of the data on the physical characteristics of those children here. So they were fairly similar across the groups. Okay, so this is our complex study design. I will explain it to you slowly. So all the kids came in the morning. They sat down for 10 minutes, and then we took a fingertip blood glucose test, should the kids allow it. So some kids weren't comfortable, so we didn't take it, but from many of the kids, we took a fingertip blood glucose test. After that, they did a series of academic and cognitive tests. So at that point, all the kids were fasted and all the kids hadn't taken any breakfast. Thereafter, they rested, and then, depending on which group they did a series of different activities. The top group is the fasted and sedentary group. So they sat down, they didn't get any breakfast, they didn't get any exercise. Later in the morning, we did a second set of just cognitive tests. And then at the end of the morning, about 3 hours later, we gave them a second set of academic and cognitive tests. The breakfast group did exactly the same, but instead of they sat down all morning, but at the same time, we gave them a short breakfast before the second set of academic and cognitive tests. The fasted and exercise group got to do physical activity, but no breakfast. And then the breakfast and exercise group got to do some physical activity, plus they ate the breakfast afterwards. During the morning, we measured certain things such as their motivation, their arousal, how they felt, their hunger, satiety, fullness, and appetite, and also how much mental effort they were putting into certain tests. This was the breakfast we gave them. It was something very simple. We needed it to be simple because we wanted the kids to eat it. It had to be something that they were likely to eat. It was probably medium glycemic index. So basically it was multigrain bread. We put some Nutella on top of it, which is like a chocolatey type spread that kids would like. And then we used a very popular local drink. I believe you have it maybe in Indonesia as well, called Milo, that kids over here like. So basically it's just a sandwich with a drink. And you can see the amount of energy and the macronutrient content for that breakfast here. So it's just a pretty moderate breakfast. Okay, when we got them to do the exercise, the two exercise groups, we got them to run on a treadmill for about 8 minutes. And then we got them to do what was called bilateral coordinative exercise. So this is exercise that involves both sides of the body being coordinated at the same time. And the reason that we did that is because there's some evidence that involving or stimulating your body's different motor groups in different ways may work on cognition. So I'll show you a quick video of the exercise that the children did. And this is just someone who was helping us with the study. This isn't one of the kids in the study. So first of all, they bounced a volleyball while standing on 2 wobble boards. So they had to keep their balance at the same time. Then they had to bounce the volleyball and basketball with both hands at the same time and switch over midway. They did this for all of these tests for 90 seconds. Then they had to throw a ball alternatively through a hoop 5 meters away using the left and right hand. Throw different sized balls to one another using the left and right hand. And then throw a ball, kick a ball to one another using left and right hand and left and right foot. So sometimes it didn't go well, sometimes it did. So basically we're trying to stimulate them in different ways using this kind of coordinative exercise. These were the academic tests that we got them to do. The left-hand side is just an arithmetic test. So it was just adding, subtraction, and multiplication. They had 60 questions to do in a minute. Some of the kids managed to finish, which is Singapore maths for you, but not everyone. But nonetheless, we looked at the total time it took them to do the test, and we looked at the number of questions that they answered correctly as well. Then we did some tests of verbal fluency. So what we do is that they give them either colors or animals, and they have to, we say, okay, we're going to ask you about a particular noun, and you have to provide us as many examples as you can within 1 minute. And it would be colors, and you would say black, white, purple, green, red, etc., etc. We would then do a similar test, but we would give you certain random letters. So you can see on the right-hand side, you have C, F, and L. And you have to name as many words as you can, beginning with that letter in 1 minute. It sounds easy, but as soon as you ask someone this, they get brain freeze. So oftentimes you don't see as many words as you would anticipate. For the cognitive tests, we used a variety of different tests. The first was the Stroop color test. Essentially what happens here is someone has to press a certain button, and it has to correspond with the color of the test. So what you can see is the word red would come up, and it would come up in the color red. So you would click red there. So that would be called a congruent test, and you would either get it correct or incorrect, depending on which color you had chosen. The incongruent test would be more difficult. So the word red would come up, but the color would be green. So you would have to press the green button, even though it said red. And then you have some controls, which are called neutrals, where the color itself just comes up. So the two data that we get out of this are the number of correct answers, and also the time taken for you to respond. The digit span test looks at another aspect of executive function, which is working memory, so your ability to withhold information in the short term. And for this, you're presented with a series of numbers, which gets gradually longer. You see those numbers for a certain amount of time, and then you have to repeat it. So there is a forward version and a backward version to this. So it may say 62196214, and then you have to type that number out. Or the backward version, you have to do it in reverse. And then the last test we gave them was a test of attention called the go, no go task. So the color comes up either green or black. And if it's a green, you have to press your space bar, and we look at the response time. And if it's black, you should not press the space bar. If you do, then it's an inaccurate measure. So it's either correct, incorrect, and we also look at the response time as well. Data analysis, we did independent t-tests for some of the data, the heart rate, RPE on the exercise data, and then we used linear mixed models to examine the change in cognitive function, academic outcomes, and subjective data over the morning. The combined intervention was used as a reference group. So we compared the other three groups with the combined intervention. So as a start, this is the blood glucose data. What you can see is that the blood glucose increases in the two breakfast groups quite dramatically over the morning. Well, not dramatically, but it goes up by about 1 millimole per litre. Whereas in the two non-breakfast groups, the blood glucose drops slightly over the morning. So this is over the 3-hour period from the start of the morning to the end of the morning, which is what you would anticipate. So breakfast is definitely doing its job. Now this is the really interesting data. This relates to the academic scores. We looked at the growth in scores over the morning. So typically what happens if you give someone any type of academic test and then you give it to them 3 hours later, they will always do better the second time than they do the first time because they know what's coming. But what we wanted to see was whether the improvement was greater in the breakfast and exercise group than in the other groups. And that is exactly what we found. The improvement in the breakfast and exercise group was better than that in the fasted and sedentary group over the morning. We didn't see any differences pre-intervention among the 4 groups, but we did see an improvement in the number of correct answers and the computation time over the morning. Now, for the tests of verbal fluency, i.e. related to animals or colour or letters, we didn't see any improvement in those tests over the morning. You can probably see that data a bit more clearly on this graph, and this just shows the percentage change in maths score and the speed in which they answered those questions in the 4 groups over the morning. So what you see is the fasted and sedentary group on the left-hand side and the breakfast and exercise group on the right-hand side. So we definitely had significant improvements in the breakfast and exercise group compared with the fasted and sedentary group. But I will say it was not significantly greater than the 2 individual groups themselves. So it wasn't greater than breakfast by itself or exercise by itself. If we look at the other measures, this shows the Stroop color test. So this is the test of inhibition, where you either have a congruent, incongruent, or a neutral test. With this particular test, we did not see any improvement in response accuracy. So the accuracy of the responses wasn't improved, but we did see an improvement in response time in the breakfast and exercise group compared with the fasted and sedentary group. So we took 3 tests over the morning, test series 1, test series 2, and test series 3. What you can see at the top, if you look at the top row, for example, the congruent test, there was no difference at baseline, test series 1, but the breakfast and exercise group was greater than the fasted and sedentary group at test series 2 and 3. And at test series 3, it was also greater than the breakfast only group. This is the digit span test. Overall, we did not see much difference. There was some slight difference when we look at the go, no go task. Again, in terms of reaction time, not in the number of errors, but that tended to be between the breakfast and exercise group and the fasted exercise group only. Looking at other measures, hunger, satiety, fullness, and appetite all increased to a greater extent in the 2 fasted groups over the morning, compared with the breakfast and exercise group. But there was no difference between breakfast and exercise and breakfast and sedentary. So certainly when you eat breakfast, it makes a difference to how you feel in terms of the amount of food in your stomach. Motivation, arousal, and mental effort were all similar at the start of the morning and across the morning in breakfast and exercise compared with the other 3 groups. So what do we want to take away from this? Essentially, the combined effects of breakfast and exercise collectively contributed to improvements in mathematics test score and computational times over the morning. We compared with a group that was fasted and sedentary. We also saw faster reaction times on an inhibitory test, the Stroop color word test. The potential factors contributing to these findings included improved blood glucose, as well as increased satiety and fullness as well. There were some limitations to our experiment, obviously. We had a parallel design group, so parallel arm group, rather than a repeated measures group. We did that deliberately, but this may have affected the difference in the rate of learning. If you have different kids in different groups, you never know whether the rate of learning is the same among them. But we did tend to recruit kids mostly from the same few schools. So it wasn't, so hopefully they would have been getting the same sort of background information in the first place in terms of their schooling. Originally, when we aimed to do this, we aimed for a lot near 120 kids. So there may have been insufficient power. We only had 80, just over 80 in the end, to determine differences from the combined intervention and the individual interventions. So we had enough power to look at whether breakfast and exercise was different from fasted and sedentary, but it may explain why we didn't see any difference in the combined group to the individual intervention groups. One of the things we didn't do was to ask their kids about their usual breakfast consumption. So some of the kids may have been taking breakfast regularly, some of the kids may not have. Now, would this have made any difference to our outcome measures? If we had rethought about this, we probably should have just recruited kids, all of whom ate breakfast regularly, or all of whom didn't eat breakfast regularly. There could have been differences in the starting point among the groups, although we did check this and we didn't see any on any of the outcome measures. And when we think about the extent of the improvement over the morning, although this was acute, the question is whether or not this would occur on a regular basis or in an ecologically valid setting like a school classroom. Do you know how much longer I've got, Professor Bastien?
If it's that's your end, then you get plenty of time, like 5-10 minutes to speak.
Okay. Yeah, I just I thought I'd just end on this study. I don't want to go into the second part of the second study because I don't want to go too much over time. But overall, what do we recommend from this particular study? We recommend that there are better academic outcomes, we believe, in adolescents who consume breakfast and who exercise regularly. This may be further improved in youth who establish both of those habits. So let's have the ideal start to a school morning rather than just one or the other wherever possible. Policymakers should recognize that these behaviors, because that's what they are, can influence school performance. People always think about having more time in the classroom, more homework, more tuition, etc., etc. But these behavioral factors, such as breakfast, physical activity, and I will say sleep as well, that's something that we didn't really look at too much here, all make a difference to children's performance in a classroom, as well as their health and other aspects of their mental and social well-being. And these things are all those which we should evaluate when we think about our children. I think particularly here in Asia, there's a lot of emphasis on academic performance, and it's something that we should bear in mind. How can schools potentially achieve this? It's not all down to the school, I will agree, but schools themselves have a responsibility. We can consider the introduction of breakfast clubs, and I know that certain schools in Singapore are already doing this. But certainly for children who maybe struggle socio-economically with their families do, breakfast clubs are one way forward. And then physical activity or physical education lessons, how can we better construct those to have more benefits for kids? One thing I would like to see is that kids in Singapore are supposed to get up to 2 to 2.5 hours of PE each week. But what typically happens is they get 1 hour one day and another hour later in the week, or in some schools, just 2 hours altogether. It might be better to spread those PE lessons out and to have them first thing in the morning, so that kids get some stimulus from that physical activity before they enter the classroom. And in addition, of course, it's hot here in Singapore like it is in Indonesia. So it's better to do the physical education lessons early in the first place. So those are some of the recommendations that I would take away from this study. I do want to go to my last slide because I do have many people to thank for this particular study, particularly the 3 individuals up the top. My close colleague who has now unfortunately left NTU and it's moved to Rikyo University in Japan, Associate Professor Masato Kawabata. He is a sports psychologist and helped me a lot with this particular study. One of our collaborators was Professor Kerry Lee, who was again at NIE when we did this study, but has now moved to the Department of Early Childhood Education, excuse me, at the Education University of Hong Kong. And working with us was also a lady who was our research assistant at the time, but has now obtained her PhD and is now at the Singapore Sports Institute, Dr. Kester Chu Hui Ching. So these 3 individuals in particular helped out with both of the studies that I presented today. And we received funding from the Education Research Funding Programme at the National Institute of Education. So I'm grateful to all of these individuals and the funding body. Thank you very much for listening. I hope the sharing has been useful and interesting. And there's another reason for you to take breakfast now.
Thank you so much, Professor Stephen Burns. Very insightful presentations. We learned a lot from your studies that you just presented to us. Now we are moving to the Q&A sessions for a session with Professor Stephen Burns. I myself, I have a lot of questions in mind, but for this first time, I would like to invite participants in the Zoom meeting. We got at the moment about 182 participants for these sessions. Anyone have any questions, comments? Please, you can just raise your hand, or maybe if you're afraid to speak in English, you can just speak in Bahasa and I will translate it into English.
I apologize. I hope my accent was okay and I spoke slowly enough for everyone.
It's great. It's great. Okay, there's questions in the chat. If no one raised the chat, I will just read the question from the chat. Yeah, here we go. Many people start their from Ilham Shafaria. Many people start their activities by eating breakfast to prepare for energy, and there are also people who are used to fasting. I see. Is there a physiological difference between people who are used to have breakfast and people who like to fast, or maybe breakfast skipping?
Before they exercise, or just before they start their day?
Perhaps before just starting the day, I guess. Yeah.
Okay. I mean, people who eat breakfast will obviously benefit to some extent from those macronutrients that they've taken in. Glucose would be the main macronutrient via which the brain feeds off, if you like, or gets its energy, and therefore that may be beneficial in some instances. I think one of the things that I highlighted in the talk, which I particularly think is important, is hunger and satiety. Particularly as the morning wears on, if you are doing something later in the morning, you may start to feel distraction if you have not eaten that morning. But as I said in the first study, what we found interesting, at least in the children that we observed, was that it wasn't the no breakfast eaters who had a negative mood state. it was the irregular breakfast eaters that seemed to be the most irritable. So when they didn't take breakfast and you're used to having breakfast, then perhaps that in itself is another factor that we need to consider.
I see.
I should say with our second experiment, what we did was that the kids did the exercise before they ate the breakfast. Now, one of the factors that you could potentially manipulate is to do it the other way around. You could eat breakfast before you exercise. So, for example, in the morning, I tend to eat at home, but then I will cycle to work. But does that make a difference to what we're measuring? That I don't know. I don't have a good answer to that. I hope that's answered the question.
Yeah. So I think that I just try to conclude from what you say. So yeah, it's better to have a regular breakfast, or you just don't have a breakfast. Rather than
In terms of mood, yes, probably.
yeah.
In terms of other outcomes, it may be better to eat breakfast, as we showed in the second study,
I see.
because that combined with the physical activity seems to at least boost the mathematics scores.
I see.
Now, of course, the work that we did was in children and it wasn't in adults. So whether you get the same sort of effect in adults, it may be debatable. So that's something to consider as well.
Sure, sure. Another question from Nabila Sahwalia. Let me read it in Bahasa and I'll translate to you. Permisi Pak, sebelumnya saya mohon izin untuk bertanya. Jadi saya punya teman yang tidak bisa sarapan karena setiap sarapan dia akan mual bahkan muntah-muntah. Pada kajian seperti ini, apa yang menyebabkan hal ini terjadi dan bagaimana cara mengatasinya? Okay, so she asked, so she has a friend, and when she consume breakfast, she tend to have vomiting. So maybe not all the time, but she tend to be vomiting when having breakfast. So she's wondering what the cause of it and how to deal with it. If you have any.
I don't know the cause. I think some people, and this includes children, don't always, particularly adolescents, they don't like to get up straight away and eat straight away. My daughter is the same to some extent. Actually, she doesn't like to eat breakfast too much.
Yeah.
I think one way to overcome it is to wait a little amount of time. So in those cases, what we do is we pack her something to take to school. So she can then either eat it on the way as she's walking along, or perhaps in the first break of the day, if there's a break early on.
Yeah.
So at least you're trying to get some food in. Another alternative would be perhaps to take a drink if they can, like a Milo, for example, if they can stomach it, because at least that has some energy and some nutrients in as well. So Milo has some sugar in, it has some micronutrients, a small amount of protein, etc., or a glass of milk. So if they can't stomach food, consider some sort of drink. And if they can't stomach food or drink straight away, then consider packing something that people can eat. So maybe after they've been up for an hour, they can snack on something.
I see. Yeah, I see. Thank you. Another question from Franz Manihook. Let me read it in bahasa first. Izin saya mau bertanya, yang kita ketahui bersama bahwa nutrisi sangat penting untuk performance atlet saat latihan maupun pertandingan. Saya ambil contoh pada atlet lari maraton yang sistem olahraga aerobik. Pada olahraga aerobik untuk kebutuhan energinya melalui proses energi yang akan menghasilkan ATP. Yang menjadi pertanyaan saya, bagaimana pengaturan nutrisi gizi seimbang yang dikonsumsi dan bagaimana peran lemak dalam nutrisi untuk menghasilkan energi kembali saat pertandingan dan latihan pada atlet lari maraton yang memiliki massa otot yang bagus tapi sedikit lemak. Okay, so he asked, so the case is for athlete, specifically for marathon athlete. So this is for athlete, for athletes, and he asked about how to manage the nutrients consumptions for athletes, for marathon athletes, in terms of their energy consumption, because they have regular competitions that they have to follow, and doing regular exercises. How to maintain or manage the nutrient for this kind of athlete?
Okay, marathon athletes are obviously a very special group. They expend a lot of energy, and the energy that they expend tends to be mostly carbohydrate if they're working at a high intensity. So I'm not talking about the people that run marathons in 7 or 8 hours, i.e. they're just sort of walking a bit. I'm talking about the people that are competing in marathons and working hard. There's a whole series of things that we can do around endurance athletes. Obviously, it's important to plan your diet to ensure that you have enough energy. Enough energy is typically considered as 45 kilocalories per kilogram of fat-free mass per day, whether it's males or females, and that's after that's after taking into account your energy expenditure. So that would be enough to keep your physiological systems running well. So we're talking about energy availability. You then have to think about the sort of training that you're doing, whether it's heavy training, light training, etc., which may depend on the point at which you are in your cycle. But at higher end training, athletes can consume up to 10 grams per kilogram, 10 grams of carbohydrate per kilogram of body mass each day. So if you weigh 60 kilos, you could be eating 600 grams of carbohydrate at least. In the lead up to the actual race, you should be looking at carbo loading. And then on the day of the race, you should take a breakfast, which one, you are familiar with, i.e. you've tried it out in practice, and two, you are assured will not cause any stomach issues or other digestive issues. On the day of your marathon, you must always do what you have done in training or practice. Do not take new foods. Do not take anything novel. It doesn't matter what the other people in the world are doing, whether it's a top marathon athlete. Don't think, oh, he does this on the day of his marathon, I'll try it out. If you haven't done it in training and practice, don't do it on the day of the marathon itself. So get used to consuming breakfast on the day of your race, and make sure it's a breakfast that you're familiar with and happy with. So I hope I briefly answered that that question, which could be very extensive.
I have another my own questions before moving to another participants. You always talk about a positive effect of breakfast, either in study 1 or study 2. I was wondering, is there any side effect or negative effect of having breakfast? Like people can, if they have much in breakfast, they might feel asleep in work in the early morning. So is there any particular research or study explaining the negative side effect of breakfast, and what standard do we need for breakfast in terms of nutrients, or how much do we need to consume in breakfast?
I don't think that you need to consume much. I think it's something that instinctively humans, we know how much we want to eat. So if you sit down, there's no need to gorge yourself at breakfast. In terms of the negative effects, I haven't seen any. I think the sleepiness tends to be more around the lunch. So insulin will go up, and also it kind of coincides with your circadian cycle. So normally when people have had lunch, it's like at any conference, the mid-afternoon session is not good to take because the audience is asleep, right? Whereas the morning session is always okay because everyone's still awake. So I think generally breakfast isn't associated with sleepiness from what I've observed or what I've read. I haven't read any side effects, but there's no need to gorge. I mean, if you take a breakfast which is fairly moderate, as we used in our study, could just be some toast or cereals or whatever is culturally normal in your country. So it could even be rice, a light rice dish. In Singapore, many people take noodles for breakfast, with maybe eggs or something. Then all of this is fine. All of this is fine. And I think people will instinctively just eat what they feel is normal.
I see. Yeah, there's a question from the participant, Miss Yade.
Okay, hi, good morning.
Hello.
Thank you for the opportunity. I'm so glad to have you here, Mr. Burns.
Thank you very much.
My name is Yade. I'm from Nutrition Department, Faculty of Sport and Health Sciences.
Hello.
And first of all, I want to say thank you for your great presentation and your fascinating study. So we can learn much from that. And my question is, unfortunately, my question is has the same with Mr. Bustang, but it's okay. Yeah, but it's okay. I have another question. It's interesting. Skip breakfast and lack of activity is always become nutrition and health problem globally, especially in Asia and Indonesia. And it's not just happened in children, adolescents, but also in adult group. My question is, some people who has a regular breakfast habit have the reason to skip breakfast because some breakfast make them sleepy, because many factors like hormonal serotonin, melatonin activity, and the other reason is some people skip breakfast because after breakfast they got more hungry, like that. Yeah, they got more hungry because insulin trigger like that. That's why they skip hungry. What do you think about that? And the second question, if it allowed, I have a second question. According to your study that you have presented, breakfast and activity can improve concentration. And could you please suggest us what kind of activity that can we do in the morning? A simple activity like that with breakfast, so we can improve our performing after that. Okay, thank you. That's all.
Okay, thank you. Maybe I'll take the second question first. I think in terms of activity, it doesn't need to be much. It could be walking to school, it could be cycling to school, it could be scooting, etc., etc. I think it's more just about energy expenditure. It could be some form of cultural activity. So, for example, older adults in Singapore, many of the Chinese older adults might do Tai Chi or something. It could be some sort of stretching or calisthenics. I think one thing that we did see was this bilateral coordinative exercise was quite useful in children. And that's something which in a way may imitate PE lessons, because in terms of physical education, kids get to learn lots of new skills. So they might learn to do basketball or netball or, I don't know, hockey, whichever sports they're undertaking. It could even be cultural activities like Salat, for example, where they have to coordinate their body in different ways. And these types of activities may be very useful in terms of building new pathways in the brain and perhaps stimulating neuroplasticity. It's difficult to show this. I mean, it's very difficult to show this. It's difficult even if you measure BDNF, because what you're measuring is circulating BDNF and not brain, not that in the central nervous system, for example. So we can never say for 100%, but in terms of activity, I would just encourage people to just be active in the morning, because I truly believe that is the best thing. So I hope that answered your second question.
Yeah.
in terms of your first question in relation to some people not wanting to take breakfast because they feel sleepy, some people feel that it stimulates them to want to eat more. I haven't seen that much data, actually. In many ways, I've seen the opposite, actually, from experimental studies. I mean, part of it is, for example, people say exercise, for example, stimulates appetite. But when I was in the UK doing my PhD, and before that, I was working with a professor there who was looking at a hormone, an appetite hormone called ghrelin, which is an orexigenic hormone, which stimulates appetite. And what we used to do was we would measure ghrelin levels after exercise, but we would also feed people a buffet meal. And it would either be in the presence of exercise beforehand, or they'd done no exercise beforehand. And what you would surprisingly find out is that in most cases, even with exercise, people ate the same as when they hadn't exercised. So it's an open buffet. We say you can eat as much as you want, and we measure the foods exactly, and we weigh them before and after what's left over. And what you find is that people don't eat more, even with the exercise. The one exception there was swimming. So swimming, perhaps because water is colder and more heat is removed from the body, tends to stimulate appetite more. Moving away from exercise, just on a regular basis, I did see some data from someone at he was in Singapore, he was in A*STAR, the Singapore Institute of Clinical Sciences, Jai Henry. And Professor Jai Henry did a very interesting study at one point where he gave kids breakfast versus no breakfast. And then he measured he gave them a breakfast which was porridge, right? Something that you have in the UK, which is kids don't like it. And then what he allowed the kids to do was to get sugar, because this is what they would do in reality. And they poured it all over this
I also didn't like it.
Porridge as well, to make them like it.
I also don't like it porridge.
Yeah, many people don't. But he put sugar on top so that the kids would eat it. So even though it's high, sugary, and they ate this porridge. But then he measured what they ate for lunch. So they'd eaten breakfast. And he found out that kids who ate the breakfast, even the sugary breakfast, they ate less for lunch, despite having higher insulin levels in the morning compared with those kids who didn't. And then someone wrote in, I think, when they published this particular study, they said, well, what about dinner? So they repeated the whole experiment again, and they measured what the kids ate for breakfast. They gave the kids the breakfast, and they measured what they did for lunch and for dinner as well. And they found the same thing. The kids tended to eat slightly less at lunch and even dinner. The effect wasn't quite as big for dinner. So I haven't necessarily seen data to suggest that people who eat breakfast put on more weight. And as I said at the start, people who eat breakfast, the associations tend to be actually having a better body weight and a better body mass index. Professor James Betts, as I said, has done some really interesting work at the University of Bath and tried to challenge all of these sorts of things. But ultimately, even he found the same. Whether you eat breakfast or you don't eat breakfast, breakfast eaters don't tend to be bigger or to have put on more weight. So people may feel they feel hungrier, but when we look at it scientifically and we look at randomized studies, that doesn't tend to be the case. So thank you for your question, but I don't have data to support that at present.
It's okay. Maybe we can do some research about this. Maybe we can collaborate about it, because in Indonesia, because the people of Indonesia have a reason like that. Okay, thank you. Thank you for your answer.
My pleasure. It's nice. Thank you for your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Ade, for the questions. So we have a lot of questions now from the participant in the Zoom meeting, but because we also live streaming on YouTube, then there's a question from our participant on YouTube. So I'll go to that questions. He say about feeding problems. So some people have a and they might skip their breakfast because of that. Is there any particular treatment or any suggestions for people who skip their breakfast because of the feeding problems, or any
Sorry.
specific exercise?
Can you
that?
just define feeding problems, did you say?
He didn't further explain about that.
Okay.
Yeah, he just say
Okay.
feeding problem. So
Okay, I'm not quite sure what's meant by that. I think it was similar to what the other lady asked earlier, where she said perhaps a friend who eats in the morning doesn't feel like eating, and then if they consume food, they may throw up at that point. So I think the only answer I have, unless I get a bit further definition, is perhaps what I said earlier. You know, to perhaps take a liquid meal, or to like a glass of milk if that's acceptable, or soy milk even, because I know many Asians are allergic to milk, or alternatively to pack something so that you wait an hour or so before you've eaten something, before you've eaten at the start of the day, and that may be the best way to approach that.
sure. I think we near the end of this session. One more questions from the participants. We got a lot of questions from the participants. He say, based on your research, is there any of breakfast give much impact with the student test result? I mean, academic test results. Is there any particular type
Yeah.
of breakfast?
It doesn't say the time of breakfast. It just says breakfast. I mean, I showed you the cross-sectional data from the UK. The study that we did was an acute study, and it was lab-based. So whether you can translate that directly into schools is a lot harder. It would be nice to do some sort of cluster design, randomized design study across schools to see whether schools that ate breakfast or didn't. But that would be very hard. A bit harsh on the children, right? To say you eat breakfast for a year and you don't eat breakfast for a year. So I don't think I will ever get permission for that.
Yeah.
But in terms of the observational data that we have, it certainly seems that it's more about eating breakfast per se than the items within breakfast that are important. The first thing to get our children to do is to eat breakfast and to be physically active in the morning. And if we can get those two behaviors established, that would be by far the best thing for the kids, at least in my opinion, based on the data that I've seen.
Sure.
Get them to eat, get them to walk to school or cycle to school. And I think that's the best way that we can get our kids to grow up. I do make my kids walk and cycle to school. And I cycle to work most days myself. So I do try to, I do believe in these behaviors. I really believe that they will be helpful.
Yeah, it's a bit difficult cycling to work or school. So me myself, I pick up my son to school with motorcycles, and a lot of people doing that same thing.
Yeah.
When I was in the UK, in Loughborough, we both a Loughborough family. I cycle to Loughborough to campuses and to schools. So, but it's not. It's very difficult here.
Yeah, I understand.
Thank you very much. I think this is the end of the first sessions of our webinars this morning. We really appreciate Professor Stephen Burns for his insightful presentations. We learned a lot from him, from his work, from his research. We really hope that our faculty and National Institute of Education, especially in the physical education, sports science academic group, we can do some collaborations. We can further our collaboration in terms of research or students and staff exchange in the near future. Here in Indonesia, we do have some programs, research program that we can get funding from it for doing research collaborations. We got ESMA, Indonesia International Mobility Students Awards. that can give grants, some grant for students from Indonesia to take some courses like 1 semester or 1 year courses abroad. So we could there are many possibilities that we can do to further our collaboration.
Thank
Thank
you
you.
so much. Thank you for the opportunity to present today. It's been really wonderful. And thank you all so much for the questions. It's great when people ask questions, and I hope it was interesting for everyone. Thank you again.
Yes, it is. It is indeed. Thank you very much, Professor Situmorns. Please accept the certificate that as an appreciation for your time, for your kindness and willingness to share the work, your research with us this morning in this event. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Next, I move it back to Pak Reza to handle the next session.
Baik, thank you very much, Mr. Mustang, for your opportunity. Baik, sesi berikutnya ke narasumber kita yang kedua, yaitu Profesor Dr. Bambang Purwanto, MKes, dan selanjutnya akan membawakan materinya selama kurang lebih 1,5 jam. Baik, dengan ini kami persilahkan kepada Profesor Bambang untuk membawakan materinya. Silakan, Prof.
Terima kasih.
Sama-sama.
Saya ucapkan terima kasih atas kesempatan yang diberikan. First of all, I want to thank to University Negeri Makassar, especially to the Professor Hamsyati, the Dean of the University Negeri Makassar. Beliau ini adalah senior kami. Salam hormat buat senior. Ya, kami dari program studi Magister Ilmu Kesehatan Olahraga, dan beliau adalah alumni kami. Mudah-mudahan untuk Budekan bisa semakin sukses ke depan. Saya dengar Budekan berikutnya ini akan menjadi kandidat kuat buat rektor UNN. Semoga sukses ya.
Insya Allah.
Okay. Allow me to share my presentation. Can you see my presentation on the screen?
Not yet, Professor.
Not yet?
Yes.
Okay. Is my voice clear?
Clear.
Can you hear it clear?
Very clear.
Sudah terlihat atau belum PowerPoint-nya?
Tampaknya masih loading ini, Prof.
Masih loading ya? Baik, baik. Ya, kalau suara sudah jelas ya?
Siap. Aman, Prof.
Ya. Aman ya. Saya akan mempresentasikan materi ini dalam 2 bahasa. Izinkan saya, allow me to present this presentation in Bahasa and also in English. I will make it easier for the audience because of all of the information inside the presentation is in English already. So I will present it also in Indonesia, in Bahasa, in order to make it more understanding for the audience. Mas Reza masih mute itu.
Ya, ini masih
Belum
sementara
terlihat ya?
nunggu ini, belum.
Nah, ada kendala ya. Sebentar, saya stop share dulu, saya share ulang ya.
Iya.
Coba. Hmm.
Iya. Kalau misalkan masih terkendala, Prof, barangkali filenya juga bisa dikirim. Nah, nanti kami yang
Baik,
tampilkan.
coba saya
Kita
kirim
coba
ya.
dulu ya. Ya.
Saya kirim lewat Darul ya.
Baik, para hadirin, mohon ditunggu sebentar sambil kita menunggu Prof Bambang kembali join.
Assalamualaikum.
Waalaikumsalam, Prof.
Nah, sudah terlihat
Ini
ya?
tampaknya sudah kelihatan. Ya,
Oke, oke.
sudah tampak di layar. Silakan, Prof.
Baik. Mungkin bisa dibantu untuk slideshow, please. Okay. Okay, I start the presentation. Today, I will share some information from our daily problems. Seringkali saat ini kita ini menghadapi banyak masalah, terutama persoalan mengenai obesitas. Banyak yang ingin ya, membakar lemaknya. Cuman persoalannya adalah banyak juga yang kecewa akhirnya karena gagal melakukannya gitu ya. Ini kok enggak turun-turun berat badannya. So I will present this presentation with the title is Reclaim in Fat Burning. So what is your purpose? Seringkali kemudian kita kehilangan tujuan karena sudah frustasi, lalu kemudian kita tidak memiliki lagi arah, sehingga apapun dilakukan. Kata orang begini ikut, kata orang begitu juga ikut. Okay, next slide. First of all, fat burning is consists of 3 steps or process. The first one is lipid withdrawal. The second one is lipid mobilization, and it all is ended with the lipolysis. These 3 process is sequences, yeah? And I will introduce you from the beginning to the end. Next slide, please. Oke. Saya akan coba presentasikan ini supaya menjadi lebih mudah dalam bahasa Indonesia karena ini akan menjadi hal yang penting. Pada saat tubuh kita itu membutuhkan fuel of energy, kita seringkali kemudian ya, mendapatkan pilihan tubuh kita. Tadi sudah disampaikan oleh Profesor Burns bahwa tubuh kita akan lebih banyak memilih glukosa, tapi sometimes gitu ya, tubuh kita juga akan memanfaatkan lemak. Memanfaatkan lemak. Nah, salah satu yang kemudian akan dimanfaatkan, yang bisa dimanfaatkan untuk fuel of energy itu adalah asam lemak. Dan di dalam tubuh kita, asam lemak ini berada dalam kondisi atau berada dalam status yang disebut dengan simpanan lemak. Simpanan lemak ini adalah triacylglycerol atau triglycerida. Triacylglycerol atau triglycerida ini disimpan di dalam beberapa tempat, yang kemudian tempat-tempat ini itu menjadi khusus. Sebagian disimpan di bawah kulit, kita sebut dengan subcutaneous fat. Sebagian disimpan di visceral organ atau metabolic organ. Ya, seperti di gambar ini ada liver, ada jantung, dan ada hati. Kita menyebutnya sebagai visceral fat. Ya. Nah, masing-masing dari fat ini itu kemudian akan dapat ditarik atau dipecah ya, untuk menghasilkan fatty acid, free fatty acids sebagai fuel of energy untuk menghasilkan ATP. Nah, untuk bisa kemudian menghasilkan free fatty acid, maka triacylglycerol atau triglycerid itu harus dipecah. Dan yang memecah ini adalah satu enzim yang disebut dengan human sensitive lipase. Ya. Jadi yang di warna kuning ini ya, di warna kuning pada gambar sebelah kiri, itu adalah human sensitive lipase yang bisa memotong-motong asam lemak gitu ya, dari triasil atau triglycerida. Yang kemudian triacylglycerol atau asam lemak dari triacylglycerol ini akan dimobilisasi melalui pembuluh darah menuju ke seluruh organ, ya, terutama ke organ-organ metabolik ya, seperti liver, hati, dan otot. Pertanyaannya kenapa kok ketiga organ ini? Karena organ ini yang memiliki banyak mitokondria. Jadi yang bisa melakukan lipolisis adalah mitokondria. Jadi darah akan mobilisasi free fatty acid itu ke seluruh organ, terutama 3 organ yang terutama memiliki banyak mitokondria. Next slide, please. Ya. Jadi organ yang memiliki banyak mitokondria itu adalah tempat yang ideal untuk mengadakan lipolisis. Dalam bahasa metabolisme kita sebut sebagai beta oksidasi. Substratnya atau bahan bakunya adalah fatty acids dan akan melalui beberapa tahapan, yaitu pertama adalah TCA cycle atau siklus Krebs yang pernah atau sering diajarkan di kelas-kelas begitu. Lalu diikuti dengan sistem transport elektron atau yang juga sering disebut dengan fosforilasi oksidatif. Nah, proses ini yang kemudian berlangsung di dalam sel-sel dari organ-organ metabolik yang memiliki banyak mitokondria. Next slide, please. Ya. Kita akan coba khusus ke fat withdrawal and mobilization. Jadi lemak ini atau triglycerid ini akan bisa dibongkar dari jaringan-jaringan yang menyimpan lemak. Jaringan-jaringan yang menyimpan lemak ini tadi sudah saya sebut ada 2 yang ada di dalam tubuh. Yang pertama adalah subcutaneous fat yang ada di bawah kulit, bisa disimpan di bawah lengan, di punggung, dan di tempat-tempat lain. Ada orang yang lengannya besar kalau gemuk, ada yang pipinya cabi kalau gemuk, ada juga yang mohon maaf, bokongnya besar kalau gemuk. Itu tergantung dari tempat predileksi dari penyimpanan lemak itu dominan di mana. Nah, lemak yang disimpan ini ada yang berbentuk white adipose, warnanya putih, dan ada yang brown adipose, warnanya coklat. Perbedaan antara keduanya bisa kita lihat pada gambar ini. White adipose itu memiliki mitokondria lebih sedikit daripada brown adipose. Tapi yang penting diingat di sini, meskipun brown adipose itu memiliki mitokondria yang lebih banyak, tapi dia tidak termasuk sebagai metabolic cells. Karena jumlah mitokondrianya itu jauh di bawah otot, liver, dan jantung. Sehingga tidak disebut sebagai primary metabolic cells. Dan yang kedua, hasil metabolisme. Lemak yang dilakukan oleh brown adipose itu tidak menghasilkan ATP, tapi menghasilkan panas. Jadi main function dari brown adipose itu generating heat. Ya itu, jadi kalau kemudian kita pernah mendengar orang-orang itu menyampaikan, orang gemuk itu tahan dingin, ada benarnya. Karena brown adipose itu memang menghasilkan panas. Catatannya adalah orang gemuk itu memiliki brown adipose yang banyak. Sayangnya brown adipose itu lebih banyak dijumpai pada anak-anak. Jadi kalau sudah dewasa brown adipose-nya berkurang. Ya, jadi ini yang kemudian kita perlu sadari bersama bahwa beberapa orang berharap yang kemudian tampaknya menjadi hal yang mustahil. Perombakan lemak, perombakan lemak yang dilakukan itu dibantu oleh satu enzim yang tadi sudah saya sampaikan, namanya enzim lipase. Dan enzim lipase ini sensitif atau dia aktif apabila distimulasi satu hormon, namanya hormon insulin. Nah, kita sudah pernah dengar ya, insulin ini hormon apa, tapi yang jelas bahwa hormon insulin ini yang berperan di dalam membantu aktivitas enzim lipase dalam merombak simpanan lemak ini menghasilkan asam lemak fatty acid yang dibutuhkan untuk fat burn. Ya. Nah, proses disable by insulin ini yang kemudian dipercaya oleh kita semua, pelaku olahraga, yang kemudian akan menurunkan massa lemak, fat mass, also reduce body weight, dan menyebabkan seseorang itu akan kelihatan kurus, kelihatan ramping, kelihatan skinny ya. Jadi untuk yang punya cita-cita atau keinginan menguruskan badan, menurunkan berat badan, nah ini yang kemudian menjadi target dari latihannya atau target dari intervensinya. Gimana caranya supaya lemak yang disimpan di subkutaneus itu bisa berkurang. Nah, itu kuncinya ada di dari enzim lipase yang distimulasi oleh insulin. Slide berikutnya. Next slide, please. The second place which fats were stored is in the visceral or tissue organs. Di tempat kedua lemak itu disimpan adalah di organ-organ visceral, organ-organ dalam yang dipercaya sebagai primary metabolic organ. Saya sebut tadi, 1, jantung, 2, liver, 3, otot. Ya. Itu 3 organ yang dipercaya kemudian memiliki kemampuan untuk bisa melakukan lipolisis. Sehingga organ-organ ini pun juga menjadi tempat penyimpanan lemak dan menjadi tempat withdraw dari lipids. Nah, persoalannya adalah lipids yang disimpan di dalam visceral organ atau metabolic organ itu tidak tersimpan dalam sel. Jadi tidak ada sel lemak yang ada di visceral organ. Karena itu visceral organ. Jadi mainly ya kalau liver itu selnya sel liver. Kalau itu jantung ya selnya sel otot jantung. Jadi tidak ada sel lemak di sana. Ya, terus lemaknya disimpan di dalam apa? Dalam bentuk droplets. Nah, ini yang bahaya. Ini yang sangat berbahaya. Karena lemak itu kemudian disimpan dalam bentuk droplets. Ya, tidak dalam bentuk sel lemak. Jadi lipid droplets itu bisa ditemukan baik itu di bawah membran dari sel itu maupun di dalamnya. Jadi kita bisa lihat pada gambar histo-PA. Ini dari hasil biopsi organ jantung dan organ liver. Kita bisa lihat ini, yang berwarna terang ini adalah lipid droplets. Bayangkan kalau di dalam liver dan di dalam jantung itu banyak droplets lemaknya seperti ini. Maka ini yang kemudian akan mengganggu kesehatan. Kita menyebut kelainan ini sebagai fatty liver atau fatty heart. Fatty heart ini dipercaya yang menjadi penyebab utama terjadinya kardiomiopati. Kardiomiopati merupakan penyebab utama sudden death. Jadi kalau kita sering melihat ada atlet atau ada olahragawan yang kemudian berolahraga lalu kemudian di tempat, itu salah satu penyebabnya adalah kardiomiopati. Dan penyebab kardiomiopati adalah lipid droplets found in the visceral organs. Karena itu visceral fat ini berbahaya, ya. Nah, jadi berbeda antara visceral fat dengan subcutaneous fat yang tadi saya jelaskan di awal. Next slide, please. Nah, sekarang kita masuk ke main topics. Karena ini kaitannya dengan olahraga, maka pertanyaan besarnya ya, how does exercise withdraw lipids? Bagaimana kemudian kalau kita melakukan exercise itu bisa merombak, membongkar simpanan lemak dalam bentuk trigliserida tadi menjadi asam lemak yang bisa dimanfaatkan untuk energi. Next slide. Saya sajikan beberapa hasil penelitian. Ya, ini yang pertama penelitiannya Wang, ya, dari publikasi beliau di tahun 2022 baru ini. Ya. Saya bacakan dalam bahasa Indonesia ya. Yang menjadi main itu saya bold ya. Yang menjadi utama, menjadi perhatian kita saya bold ya. Bahwa penelitian ini merupakan penelitian meta-analisis, jadi rangkuman dari penelitian yang sudah pernah dilakukan oleh seluruh pakar di seluruh dunia, yang hasilnya adalah sebagai berikut. Bahwa intervensi berupa exercise yang dilakukan itu dapat mengurangi visceral fat yang disimpan tadi, yang ada ditemukan di organ ya, dalam atau metabolic organ tadi seperti liver dan jantung. Pada utamanya, nah ini young people, orang-orang muda, ya, atau adolescents. Young people itu yang dimaksud adalah adolescents, usia 12 sampai 18 tahun, and young adults, usia 18 sampai 24 tahun. Jadi efek exercise untuk mengurangi visceral fat itu akan signifikan pada usia ini. Sekarang mari kita tanya diri sendiri usia kita berapa gitu ya. Jadi kalau mau mengurangi visceral fat itu efek exercise terbaiknya dilakukan oleh young people gitu ya. Yang memiliki berat badan berlebih dan mengalami obesitas. Yang kedua, semua jenis exercise itu sebetulnya punya efek. Hanya catatan yang di bold itu penting diingat, high intensity interval training atau HIIT yang sekarang lagi happening, yang memiliki efektivitas paling tinggi sebagai exercise yang mampu menurunkan lemak atau yang mampu membongkar lemak. Nah, dan catatan paling penting di sini adalah HIIT itu memiliki efek yang lebih baik daripada aerobic exercise. Di buku-buku yang lalu, itu literatur lama, itu dipercaya bahwa aerobic exercise itu satu-satunya yang bisa membakar lemak. Karena dia menghadirkan banyak oksigen. Oksigen dibutuhkan untuk membakar lemak, karena lemak hanya bisa dibakar dengan oksigen. Itu yang dipresentasikan begitu. Tapi sekarang hasil meta-analisis ini membantah itu. Bahwa high intensity interval training atau anaerobic exercise is better than aerobic exercise to burn fat. This is no doubt ya. Jadi ini sudah meta-analisis, berarti sudah merangkum semua studi yang ada selama ini. Dan perlu dicatat lagi paling bawah, more significant in boys than in girls. Nah, ini perlu dicatat ya. Jadi artinya high intensity interval training yang dilakukan seorang wanita, girls, itu untuk bisa membakar lemak harus lebih intensif dan harus lebih lama untuk mendapatkan hasil yang sama dengan yang dilakukan oleh boys. Tapi kalau boys itu jauh lebih mudah kemudian mengurangi lemak tubuhnya. Nah, ini kabar bagus buat Mas Reza ya. Next slide please.
Alhamdulillah, Prof.
Alhamdulillah. Jurnal kedua, ini artikel kedua ya, yang saya citasi dari Freud tahun 2012. Jadi Freud dan kawan-kawan, itu Freud and Butcher melakukan satu eksperimen dengan intervensi berupa high intensity intermittent exercise. Jadi a single put short term high intensity exercise pada young males ya, laki-laki muda ya, yang mengalami overweight, berat badannya berlebih. Beliau dan kawan-kawan mengevaluasi perubahan visceral fat, lemak yang ada di dalam organ dalam, yang ada di metabolik organ seperti hati, liver, dan otot itu, dan yang tersimpan di bawah kulit atau subcutaneous fat yang sebelah kanan, gambar sebelah kanan. Kita lihat hasilnya, kita mulai dari hasil yang sebelah kiri, ternyata dari dua grup yang dibandingkan, ternyata grup yang melakukan exercise, dalam hal ini high intensity intermittent exercise, itu berhasil menurunkan fat mass-nya. Sedangkan yang tidak melakukan, yang kontrol grup, yang sebelah kanan, nah itu tidak mengalami perubahan. Fat mass-nya tetap. Ya, jadi harus exercise. Jadi kalau gurauannya teman-teman di kedokteran itu, lemak itu tidak mungkin dibakar dengan doa. Jadi kalau cuma berdoa saja lemaknya tetap ya. Harus dengan exercise. Yang kedua, di gambar kedua yang di tengah ya, dibandingkan kondisi sebelum exercise dan setelah exercise, yang berwarna gelap itu adalah kondisi sebelum, dan yang berwarna terang adalah kondisi sesudah exercise. Ternyata visceral fat dari individu yang melakukan exercise mengalami penurunan yang signifikan, bermakna. Ya, kita lihat ya, itu. Jadi ketika mau melakukan high intensity intermittent exercise, visceral fat-nya turun. Nah, ini berbeda dengan yang sebelah kanan. Di sebelah kanan ternyata efek dari high intensity intermittent exercise itu tidak merubah subcutaneous fat, baik yang di tangan, yang di kaki maupun yang di punggung. Jadi tidak ada perubahan sama sekali. Artinya adalah high intensity intermittent exercise, single put yang cuman sekali, dan short term, itu hanya berdampak kepada visceral fat. Hanya bisa membongkar yang ada di metabolic organ. Ya, kalau seperti ini saya menjelaskannya mudah. Ya, karena bisa langsung dipakai. Tempat membakarnya itu di visceral fat, di visceral, di metabolic organ, disimpannya juga di situ. Jadi kalau olahraganya cuma sekali dan singkat, ya otomatis mudah untuk kemudian nggak perlu dimobilisasi kemana-mana, cukup di situ langsung dipakai. Ya, jadi sekali lagi, karena tidak berdampak kepada subcutaneous fat, maka high intensity intermittent exercise itu jangan diharapkan dapat membuat tubuh kita menjadi kurus. Jangan berharap membuat bokong kita menjadi lebih kecil. Atau jangan berharap membuat pipi kita jadi tirus. Karena itu dari penelitian ini menyampaikan tidak mungkin. Ya, kalau hanya sekali melakukan exercise dan itu short term menggunakan high intensity intermittent exercise, maka yang terdampak itu yang tidak terlihat, yang di dalam. Ya. Jadi efeknya itu efek dalam, efek gaib, efek yang tidak terlihat. Tapi bisa dirasakan, orangnya akan menjadi lebih segar dan hanya bisa diketahui dari pemeriksaan medis. Karena ini visceral fat, ya. Jadi penampakan luarnya tidak akan berubah, tapi dalamnya itu akan berubah dari pemeriksaan medis, gitu ya. Jadi Bapak Ibu yang hadir di sini kalau kepingin ngurusin berat badan, ya baru sekali latihan, itu jangan berharap massa lemaknya berkurang. Slide berikutnya. Sekarang kita tadi sudah belajar di awal bahwa untuk membongkar cadangan lemak dalam bentuk triacylglycerol itu membutuhkan satu bantuan enzim namanya lipase. Ya. Nah, ini ada satu penelitian yang dilakukan oleh Liu tahun 2020. Latihan, ya, sama latihannya high intensity interval training. Ternyata betul, ya, setelah diperiksa, grup yang melakukan high intensity interval training ini mengaktifkan lebih banyak enzim lipase. Kita bisa lihat di sini. Jadi yang berwarna merah itu adalah grup yang, ya, mendapatkan makanan tinggi lemak. Yang berwarna biru adalah grup yang mendapatkan makanan tinggi lemak lalu diolahragakan secara aerobik, moderate intensity continuous training, ya. Yang biru. Yang putih yang tidak berwarna itu adalah grup yang mendapatkan makanan tinggi lemak lalu diberikan porsi latihan high intensity interval training. Dan bisa kita lihat di sini bahwa efek dari moderate intensity continuous training atau aerobic exercise itu tidak bermakna, tidak merubah baik itu PAT maupun SCAT, baik itu visceral fat maupun subcutaneous fat. Ya. Hanya yang melakukan high intensity interval training yang kemudian berdampak pada simpanan yang ada di visceral dan sekaligus, ya, sekaligus mengaktifkan banyak enzim lipase. Jadi dari penelitian yang kedua ini kita bisa mengambil pelajaran bahwa untuk bisa membongkar lemak kita butuh sekali hormon insulin untuk mengaktifkan lipase. Jadi lipase ini menjadi hal yang sangat penting. Jadi ini bukti bahwa enzim lipase berperan di dalam proses pembongkaran lemak melalui aktivitas high intensity interval training. Slide berikutnya. Ya, ini masih lanjutan dari penelitiannya Liu. Ternyata yang kita dapatkan adalah efek dari exercise terhadap aktivitas enzim lipase itu terkuat, tertinggi diperoleh 1 jam setelah latihan. Jadi kalau Bapak Ibu melakukan latihan high intensity interval exercise, lalu berhenti, stop, selesai, 1 jam kemudian, 1 jam kemudian, itu akan diperoleh efek terkuat pada pembongkaran lemak. Jadi kalau ditanya, kapan pembongkaran lemak terjadi? Bukan pada saat exercise-nya, tapi 1 jam post exercise. 1 jam after break exercise, ya. Nah, yang dikasih panah-panah itu ya. Itu konsisten semuanya 1 jam post exercise. Nah, pertanyaannya apa yang terjadi pada 1 jam post exercise? Kok terjadi peningkatan aktivitas lipase dan pembongkaran lemak di tempat-tempat penyimpanan lemak? Coba next slide, please. Dari jurnal yang lain kita dapatkan, sama judulnya masih high intensity interval exercise, ya, kita bisa dapatkan ternyata 1 jam post exercise, jadi setelah kita berhenti bereksersis, ya, maka terjadi peningkatan kadar hormon insulin di dalam tubuh kita. Nah, tampaknya ini jawabannya. Berarti betul bahwa yang mengaktifkan enzim lipase itu adalah insulin. Yang membongkar lemak tubuh kita adalah insulin. Jadi kita butuh insulin. Dan insulin ini akan meningkat baik kadar maupun aktivitasnya 1 jam setelah kita melakukan exercise. Ya. Ini hal yang menarik karena selama ini yang kita ketahui dari buku-buku yang kita baca atau literatur yang kita baca, insulin ini akan keluar ketika kita makan. Jadi kalau kita makan, setelah makan 1 jam kemudian insulin keluar. Jadi pancingannya adalah makanan. Tapi ternyata insulin juga bisa dipancing dengan exercise. Pesan moralnya di sini hati-hati Bapak Ibu. Karena insulin itu menyebabkan lapar. Insulin itu menyebabkan sensasi lapar. Jadi setelah exercise 1 jam kemudian itu pasti akan memunculkan rasa lapar. Itu tanda bahwa kadar insulin kita sedang tinggi. Dan kalau kita tidak tahan itu, lalu kemudian kita turuti keinginan untuk makan karena lapar, 1 jam post exercise, maka cita-cita Bapak Ibu untuk kurus sudah lupakan saja. Ini yang menyebabkan kenapa saya setelah ikut senam, setelah ikut fitness, setelah ikut macam-macam, kok tambah gemuk ya. Karena 1 jam setelah exercise, justru makannya dipol-polin. Ini kenapa kok saya mempresentasikan ini dalam bahasa Indonesia. Mohon maaf, ya, supaya tidak salah paham. Karena informasi ini penting. Karena banyak orang yang kemudian keliru dan frustasi. Kenapa saya sudah berolahraga sekian lama, ternyata tetap saja gemuk. Nah, ini. Jawabannya sekarang sudah tahu. Jadi kuncinya setelah 1 jam exercise, tahan jangan makan. Karena itu puncak dari rasa lapar. Puncak dari insulinnya di situ. Kalau dipenuhi, tambah gemuk. Slide berikutnya. Ya, jadi kalau kita rangkum ya dari informasi dari awal. Kita punya high intensity intermittent atau interval activity. Ada yang short, HIIE, high intensity interval exercise, ada yang long, yang berulang dalam waktu yang lama, HIIT, high intensity interval training. Masing-masing itu memiliki efek yang berbeda. Kalau yang short HIIE itu akan membongkar cadangan lemak yang ada di visceral, yang ada di organ jantung, yang ada di organ liver, yang ada di organ otot. Mohon maaf, ini solusi terbaik buat Bapak Ibu yang usianya itu ya sudah bukan disebut lagi young tadi. Jadi kalau usianya sudah tidak disebut young, ya kita harus akui seperti saya ini sudah tidak young lagi. Kalau Mas Reza masih young. Maka fokus tujuan kita untuk kemudian berlatih untuk mengurangi lemak itu jangan diarahkan untuk menurunkan berat badan. Sekali lagi jangan dipakai tujuannya untuk menurunkan berat badan atau mengurangi fat mass. Itu agak sulit, Bapak. Tapi kita punya new purpose. Purpose-nya apa? Mengurangi visceral fat. Itu sudah sangat bagus. Artinya Bapak Ibu akan terbebas dari sakit jantung, akan terbebas dari sakit liver. 2 ini yang kemudian banyak menyebabkan gangguan kesehatan dan kematian. Jadi PR-nya untuk yang sudah tidak lagi muda, sekali-sekalilah melakukan HIIE. Ya, nggak harus rutin, enggak. Yang penting sekali-sekali supaya fat yang disimpan di visceral itu berkurang. Dan kalau itu berkurang, Bapak Ibu akan merasa lebih segar, lebih sehat. Ya, insya Allah begitu. Kalau enggak percaya, setelah latihan pergi ke lab periksa, pergi ke dokter periksa. Ya. Nah, bahkan sekarang ini sudah banyak alat yang bisa digunakan untuk memprediksi visceral fat ini. Nah, untuk yang masih young, yang masih muda, ya, yang apalagi yang masih jomblo, seperti Mas Reza. Mas Reza sudah punya belum?
Udah, Prof.
Yang masih memimpikan body goals, body image-nya itu menjadi hal yang penting gitu ya. Maka
Masih, bro.
Maka Anda harus melakukan HIIT. Karena tujuan utamanya itu membongkar lemak yang ada di subcutaneous. Dan itu tidak bisa cuma sekali latihan. Tidak bisa. Itu harus berulang kali. Jadi kalau ingin meniruskan pipi, kalau kemudian ingin, mohon maaf ya, mengurangi lemak yang di triceps, ingin mengurangi lemak yang di punggung, yang di bokong, dan sebagainya, Anda harus melakukan high intensity interval training. Tidak bisa cuma sesekali saja. Ya. Ada yang bilang aerobic exercise saja, HIIT, HII-nya sekali-sekali. Oh, tidak bisa. Nggak akan kurus, nggak akan berkurang. Ya. Nah, baik keduanya, baik HII maupun HIIT, sama-sama meningkatkan aktivitas insulin yang dibutuhkan untuk bagaimana mengaktifkan lipase yang membongkar lemak. Jadi kuncinya ada di sana, insulin, lipase. Ya. Nah, saudara, ini penting sekali, juga perlu diingat bahwa terutama untuk yang ya diperhatikan ini. Selain panah ke bawah itu, dari pembongkaran lemak yang di subcutaneous akibat dari intervensi high intensity interval training, jadi latihan terus-menerus yang high intensity dalam jangka waktu yang lama, itu juga menyebabkan mobilisasi lemak menuju ke visceral organ. Jadi lemak yang sudah dibongkar tadi dalam bentuk free fatty acid itu akan dimobilisasi. Dimobilisasi itu digerakkan, dibawa menuju ke visceral organ. Dibawa ke liver, dibawa ke jantung. Yang artinya kalau liver dan jantungnya itu tidak difungsikan metabolismenya, maka juga akan menyebabkan penimbunan droplet lemak di sana. Hati-hati ya. Jadi ini juga ada masalah. Artinya kita tidak hanya berhenti bisa di high intensity interval training saja. Karena potensi ketika kita hanya melakukan itu, memang tubuh kita menjadi lebih kurus. Lemak kita menjadi berkurang. Tapi lemak yang di darah dan di organ itu bisa meningkat. Dan ini sudah kita temukan dan menjadi penyebab utama. Sekarang ini banyak, terutama pada profesional muda ya, yang kesehatan, ya, yang suka nge-gym dan sebagainya. Mereka tubuhnya bagus-bagus, ya Mas Reza ya. Ototnya terbentuk dan semuanya. Tapi ketika darah diambil, dilakukan medical check up, kaget mereka. Lemak darahnya tinggi. Dan lemak di organnya juga tinggi. Loh, kok bisa? Nah, yang disalahkan makanannya. Nah, lupa, padahal sebetulnya ini adalah efek dari latihannya dia. Ini yang harus saya sampaikan. Jadi nggak menakut-nakuti ya, tapi ini adalah hal yang penting. Sehingga pertanyaan besar berikutnya adalah HIIT ini produce a novel skinny obese. Jadi ini sekarang ada istilah baru yang disebut dengan skinny obese. Orangnya kurus, timbunan lemak di subcutaneousnya berkurang. Tapi disebut obese karena lemaknya numpuk di darah dan lemaknya numpuk di visceral organ. Ini lalu bagaimana supaya kita terhindar dari ini? Ini pertanyaan besar berikutnya. Next slide. So how to get less in subcutaneous without high in visceral? Ini kan menakutkan. Kelihatannya keren, kelihatannya kurus, kelihatannya lean, tapi di dalamnya menyimpan banyak lemak droplet. Nah, ini bahaya. Lemak bahaya ya. Coba kita lihat slide berikutnya. Next slide please. Nah, ada jalan keluar sebetulnya. Simpanan lemak di visceral atau visceral fat dalam bentuk lipid droplets itu tidak akan mungkin terjadi selama visceral organ tersebut memiliki mioglobin yang tinggi. Nah ini. Selama ini kita hanya fokus pada hemoglobin, terutama teman-teman di olahraga. Ya. Pokoknya gimana caranya atlet itu endure hemoglobinnya harus bagus. Teman-teman di gizi juga gitu. Gimana caranya supaya nggak anemia, hemoglobinnya tinggi. Nah, ternyata sejawatnya hemoglobin yang namanya mioglobin itu punya peran sentral. Mencegah timbulnya lipid droplets di visceral organ. Selain itu, mioglobin ini juga yang memperantarai lemak yang tadi dimobilisasi lewat darah, ya, asam lemak yang tadi beredar di darah itu kemudian bisa masuk ke dalam sel dan masuk ke dalam mitokondria untuk dimetabolisme. Ini ada satu jurnal saya sajikan, ya, juga baru tahun 2022. Yang menyatakan hal tersebut. Bahkan dia melakukan ya, biopsi dari jantung. Jantung itu dibiopsi, dilihat. Ternyata kita temukan ya, pada grup yang mioglobinnya rendah, ini mioglobin negatif, berarti mioglobinnya rendah. Kita temukan banyak sekali lipid droplet yang berwarna merah-merah. Kalau kita lihat grafiknya, ya, lipid droplet ini meningkat pada individu yang mioglobinnya rendah dibandingkan dengan yang wild type ini. Jadi, kalau ingin supaya high intensity interval training tadi tidak menyebabkan timbunan lemak di visceral, maka upayakan di dalam organ-organ dalam kita, terutama jantung dan liver, itu mioglobinnya tinggi. Itu mioglobinnya tinggi. Harus tinggi supaya tidak terjadi timbunan lipid droplets. Next slide please. Jadi kalau kemudian kita rangkum keseluruhan ini, maka kalau purpose kita, if you have purpose to become skinny, untuk bisa kurus, untuk bisa turun ya, fat mass-nya, maka saudara bisa pilih ya jalur yang sebelah kanan. Maka Anda harus melakukan high intensity interval training dengan catatan supaya tidak terjadi counter yang menyebabkan timbunan lipid droplets di visceral organ, maka Anda harus upayakan mioglobin di dalam visceral organ itu tinggi. Di jantung, di liver, dan di otot harus tinggi. Tapi kalau sekedar kemudian ya saya sudah tua, usia sudah nggak muda lagi, yang penting sehat. Sudah tidak ada keinginan untuk punya lean body mass, tidak kepingin skinny, tidak kepingin yang macam-macam. Yang penting sehat, yang penting punya energi yang luar biasa, endurance dalam melakukan aktivitas, maka sekali-sekalilah melakukan high intensity interval exercise. Sekali-sekali saja ya. Supaya kemudian visceral fat itu bisa dibakar, bisa di burn, ya. dan tidak numpuk di sana terlalu banyak, karena itu yang menyebabkan banyak gangguan kesehatan dan kematian. Oke, last but not least, next slide, the end of this presentation. Oh,
Udah,
yang
Prof.
penting kemudian perlu untuk diingat bahwa high intensity activity itu penting untuk fat burn. Jadi bukan lagi moderate intensity atau aerobic exercise. Dan yang perlu diingat, sesuaikan tujuan Anda dengan ikhtiar atau intervensi yang Anda ingin lakukan. Apakah long atau short? Apakah saudara masih muda ataukah sudah tidak muda lagi? Thank you very much. Saya kembalikan untuk Mas Reza. Makasih.
You're welcome. Terima kasih banyak Prof. Bambang Purwanto, luar biasa tadi. Isinya daging semua ini, Prof. Banyak hal yang saya pikir baru saja kita tahu, termasuk bagi saya. Ternyata 1 jam kita setelah berolahraga itu, jadi bukan hanya karena makanan insulin kita keluar, tetapi juga ada exercise. Maka dari itu biasanya kalau kita perhatikan faktanya ya, kita lagi di sebuah kegiatan, katakanlah misalnya Car Free Day ya, jalan-jalan 1 jam barangkali habis itu justru ternyata makannya lebih banyak. Justru ternyata ini yang memancing berat badan menjadi naik berlebihan ya. Baik, terima kasih sekali lagi Prof. Selanjutnya saya berikan kesempatan kepada para peserta yang ingin bertanya. Ini sudah ada Pak Etno Setyagraha. Baik, silakan Coach Etno. Ini kebetulan partner kami di Fakultas Olahraga. Silakan Coach.
Terima kasih banyak Pak Reza. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Terima kasih banyak Prof. Bambang sudah memberikan kami insight yang sangat banyak, dan ini menjadi pembelajaran untuk kami sendiri karena banyak yang terlalu berfokus kepada prestasi tapi lupa akan basic kebugarannya, dan Prof akhirnya memberikan kami banyak masukan tentang hal tersebut. Nah, terkait tadi Prof yang masalah high intensity interval training, saya pernah dengar istilah excess post exercise oxygen consumption, efek EPOC, karena kebutuhan akan oksigen yang banyak sehingga metabolisme itu semakin tinggi dan kalori yang dibakar itu semakin banyak. Apakah dalam pembakaran kalori tersebut, apakah juga memang termasuk lemak, bukan cuma gulanya saja yang hilang, atau karena ada juga yang pernah saya dengar bahwa untuk menurunkan lemak keseluruhan tubuh itu disarankan untuk olahraga intensitas rendah. Mohon penjelasannya Prof. Terima kasih.
Baik, bagaimana Prof. Bambang, apakah langsung dijawab atau kita terima 2 penanya lagi?
Saya jawab ya, nanti
Iya, langsung
lupa.
saja. Iya,
Sudah
silakan
muda
Prof.
lagi.
Kecuali yang
Mas
ini yang
Retno,
masuk lewat chat, nanti saya bisa gabung barangkali pertanyaannya. Monggo Prof.
Oke, baik. Ya. Baik, terima kasih Mas Etno ya. Ini pertanyaan yang banyak ditanyakan orang. Memang anggapan yang tadi disampaikan itu rasional. Ya, terutama tadi kalau kita kaitkan dengan pertanyaan sebelumnya pada waktu Profesor Burns presentasi, ada yang tanya mengenai maraton tadi kan. Itu maraton itu kan butuh energi yang banyak gitu ya. Sehingga kemudian butuh suplai oksigen yang tinggi. Nah, dari situ kemudian orang berpikir bahwa ya kalau begitu untuk bisa menghasilkan energi yang tinggi, butuh suplai oksigen yang banyak, ya jalan satu-satunya adalah aerob. Karena kalau HIIT atau HIE itu kita tahu itu anaerobik gitu kan. Sehingga suplai oksigennya juga sedikit. Pernah ada satu kajian mengenai itu, dan kebetulan saya tidak sampaikan jurnalnya di sini, bahwa efek dari kita melakukan satu olahraga anaerobik berulang dengan aerobik berulang itu hasilnya sama. Karena sekali lagi kita jangan terpancang pada bagaimana peran hemoglobin dalam delivery oksigen. Jadi oksigen itu memang dibutuhkan, Tapi oksigen yang dibutuhkan untuk bisa menunjang metabolisme adalah oksigen yang ada di dalam sel. Karena metabolisme berlangsung di dalam sel. Itu ya Mas Etna ya. Nah, oksigen yang ada di dalam sel itu yang selama ini kita tidak tahu bahwa oksigen itu bisa disimpan. Dan yang menyimpan, yang mengikat oksigen itu adalah mioglobin. Jadi walaupun olahraga yang kita lakukan itu anaerobik, itu bukan menjadi masalah karena sejumlah oksigen itu sudah ada di dalam sel untuk siap dipakai. Nah, seseorang dengan mioglobin yang tinggi itu akan membantu dia untuk bisa tetap melakukan aerobik metabolism meskipun olahraganya adalah high intensity. Nah, ini yang kemudian menjelaskan kenapa kemudian high intensity exercise itu juga bisa berdampak pada lemak, bahkan jauh lebih tinggi, jauh lebih signifikan efeknya daripada aerobic exercise. Sehingga sekarang orang mengubah mindsetnya. Kalau kemudian kita mau burn fat, mau turunkan berat badan, kalau kita mau pakai aerobic exercise itu butuh waktu yang lama. Waktunya lama. Bisa tapi waktunya lama. Nah, kalau kemudian ingin supaya kita bisa mendapatkan hasil yang lebih cepat, solusinya pakai high intensity exercise atau high intensity interval training. Tapi dengan catatan tadi, kuncinya ada di mioglobinnya. Mioglobinnya harus tinggi. Supaya kemudian bisa menunjang high intensity exercise ini atau high intensity interval training ini efeknya bisa sampai ke meningkatkan metabolisme lemak. Gitu Mas.
Baik Prof, terima kasih banyak penjelasannya, luar biasa. Terima kasih.
Sama-sama.
Baik, terima kasih Prof. Bambang atas jawabannya dan Coach Etno. Silakan jika masih ada pertanyaan yang ingin disampaikan secara langsung, silakan raise hand dan kami akan persilakan untuk menyampaikan pertanyaannya. Oke, belum ada raise hand sampai saat ini. Mohon izin saya akan bacakan pertanyaan yang ada di kolom chat. Pertama dari Agung Hedi Endaryanto. Dari uraian Prof. Bambang, dari kesimpulan HIIT untuk mengamankan fat harus meningkatkan mioglobin. Pertanyaannya bagaimana cara meningkatkan mioglobin? Pertanyaan pertama, Prof. Monggo barangkali ingin langsung dijawab.
Baik, ini yang saya tunggu sebetulnya. Juga nanti akan menjawab pertanyaannya Mas Etno sebetulnya. Oke, baik. Sampai sekarang belum ada riset yang klaim bisa meningkatkan mioglobin. Belum ada satu riset pun. Ya. Semua riset itu mengarah ke bagaimana meningkatkan mioglobin. Mulai dari pemberian hormon, nutrients, gizi, ya, sampai ke exercise. Yang directly bisa meningkatkan mioglobin belum ada satu riset yang mendukung. Tapi saya punya satu clue begini. Mioglobin berdasarkan riset yang kami lakukan. Jadi kami punya bimbingan beberapa. Nomor satu, mioglobin ini dia merupakan bagian dari properties oksidatif dari sel. Jadi ketika kita bicara mengenai metabolisme aerobik yang dilakukan di mitokondria, di sana ada serangkaian enzim yang tadi saya gambarkan di dalam salah satu slide. Ketika sel itu memproduksi enzim-enzim tersebut, termasuk juga mengenerate mitokondria, mioglobinnya ikut tergenerate, ikut meningkat. Artinya adalah kita kalau mau meningkatkan mioglobin itu tidak terlepas dari development dari sel itu menghasilkan mitokondria yang banyak dan sel itu menghasilkan enzim yang banyak. Nah, kalau seperti itu maka kita tarik lebih ke pangkal lagi. Siapa yang kemudian berperan di dalam mengenerate mitokondria, melakukan biogenesis terhadap mitokondria? mengenerate sekian banyak enzim itu termasuk mitokondria. Kuncinya itu adalah ada pada ekspresi gen dari myosin heavy chain yang 7B. Yang kemudian itu akan mengkode MIR499 yang kemudian akan berdampak pada FNIP dan seterusnya ke bawah. PGC1 alfa dan seterusnya. Nah, ini yang kemudian disadari bahwa kuncinya terletak pada bagaimana kita merespon perubahan sel itu dari kondisi yang sebelum matur menjadi matur. Makanya tadi kita lihat pada beberapa jurnal penelitian bahwa efek dari exercise untuk menurunkan lemak atau membongkar lemak itu signifikan pada young, gitu kan ya. Kuncinya di sana, karena pada saat young itu adalah kunci dari ketika transisi development dari yang tadi semula ya, kondisinya mioglobinnya rendah ke mioglobinnya yang tinggi. Ketika mitokondrianya sedikit menjadi lebih banyak. Itu kuncinya di sana. Nah, sekarang pertanyaannya bagaimana meningkatkan ekspresi gen tadi? Itu kita sudah temukan jawabannya. Jawabannya adalah yang ditanyakan oleh Coach Etno tadi. Apa itu? Aerobic exercise. Jadi kita tidak bisa tinggalkan aerobic exercise. Karena aerobic exercise itu yang membuat dasar. Yang mempersiapkan metabolik organ itu memiliki mitokondria yang banyak, memiliki mioglobin yang tinggi. Kalau itu sudah, baru kita bisa dirikan bangunan high intensity exercise di atas dasar yang kuat tadi. Nah, kita ini seringkali ikut-ikutan gitu kan. Karena tahu informasi ada high intensity exercise training ini kemudian punya efek bisa membongkar lemak fat burn, maka ikut-ikutan high ini. Padahal kita tidak punya aerobic capacity status yang bagus. Otomatis mioglobin kita itu juga dipertanyakan. Akibatnya apa? Akibatnya hasil yang kita harapkan itu enggak sesuai dengan yang kita dapatkan. Nah, ini Coach Edna sudah mulai manggut-manggut. Paham? Jadi harus dimulai dari awal berarti. Ketika masih usia belasan teenage, itu kita bangun dasar kapasitif oksidatif yang bagus. Supaya gennya terekspresi, mioglobinnya jadi tinggi. Nah, ketika dia masuk ke usia adult, diberikan intervensi high intensity exercise training itu ngefek. Paham ya gitu ya? Jadi saya belum punya solusi singkatnya. Kalau mau ditanyakan misalnya hormon apa, obat apa, suplemen apa, atau kemudian nutrisi apa yang bisa meningkatkan mioglobin, tidak ada. Selain seseorang yang memang ketika dia masa remajanya, dia sering melakukan aktivitas aerobik, yang itu akan membangun mioglobinnya menjadi lebih tinggi, termasuk juga mitokondrianya dan enzim-enzim oksidatifnya. Gitu jawabannya.
Baik, terima kasih Prof. Mohon izin untuk membacakan 3 pertanyaan selanjutnya ini. Ya, dari IPA Sarikardi di Papua, bagaimana dengan penderita diabetes mellitus yang punya masalah dengan insulin, Prof? Apakah tetap diterapkan HIT? Ya, demikian.
Ya, jadi untuk penderita diabetes ini spesial ya, spesial. Jadi kita memang tidak bisa memberikan rekomendasi exercise begitu saja. Kita harus memperhatikan kondisi existing pada saat dia mau melakukan exercise. Kadar gulanya, kadar lemaknya, HDL-nya, dan seterusnya. Karena resiko pada diabetes itu kalau kita memberikan high intensity exercise, itu akan menyebabkan jumlah keton itu akan meningkat dan itu akan menyebabkan darahnya menjadi asam. Ini bahaya karena akan terjadi asidosis yang berdampak kepada kesehatan berikutnya. Sehingga saran saya untuk penderita diabetes, sebelum Anda melakukan exercise, konsultasi dulu dengan dokter, ya. Apa yang boleh dan apa yang tidak boleh. Tapi coba untuk yang bertanya nanti di googling atau dicari di YouTube ya. Dari Persatuan Diabetes Indonesia yang bekerja sama dengan kami, itu kami sudah membuatkan satu rekomendasi olahraga yang tepat. Sudah kita hitung, sudah kita riset. Yaitu senam diabetes, senam Persadia. Itu sudah diriset. Ya. Dan itu tidak membahayakan, tapi menyehatkan buat penderita diabetes. Ya. Sekali lagi untuk penderita diabetes yang juga mengalami obesitas itu. Untuk kemudian berusaha mengurangi berat badannya dengan cara mencoba menerapkan high intensity exercise, saya tidak merekomendasikan. Ya. Kalau sesekali boleh, tapi dalam pengawasan dokter. Tujuannya bukan untuk menurunkan berat badan ya, tapi untuk menyehatkan jantungnya dan livernya. Karena orang diabetes nanti beresiko sering terjadi miokard, ya, kardiomiopati sama fatty liver, yang itu juga akan menyebabkan gangguan kesehatan. Jadi salah satu komplikasinya ke sana. Saya kira itu yang bisa saya sarankan untuk penderita diabetes.
Baik, terima kasih Prof. Saya kira sangat jelas tadi bahwa bagi penderita diabetes itu bahkan sudah ada panduannya ya di YouTube yang bisa kita ikuti, yaitu senam diabetes. Saya kira sudah sangat teknis tadi penjelasan dari Prof. Bambang. Kemudian saya bacakan pertanyaan berikutnya dari Visio Adi Sampurno. Adakah ketentuan maksimal penurunan berat badan tiap minggu atau tiap bulan? Artinya jika penurunan berat badan itu ekstrim, apakah punya efek yang berlebihan? Demikian pertanyaannya, Prof.
Baik, terima kasih. Penurunan berat badan ini juga harus dievaluasi loh ya. Dievaluasi itu artinya benar karena latihannya atau karena hal yang lain. Ya, saya khawatir nanti ya latihan, tapi berat badannya turun bukan karena latihan, karena sekarang sering banyak begitu. Justru turun berat badannya disebabkan oleh karena justru dia kena diabetes. Ada turun berat badannya justru dia karena kena TBC atau kena penyakit-penyakit yang lain. Jadi itu yang harus dipastikan dulu ya. Jadi benar-benar kondisinya sehat, lalu kemudian baru kita bicara mengenai efek latihannya. Nah, kalau efek latihan ini kemudian yang baik berapa gitu ya, turunnya gitu ya. Jadi setiap orang ini punya standar sendiri-sendiri ya. Jadi itu juga tidak bisa dibuat sama. Sangat bergantung pada kondisi awalnya juga seperti apa gitu ya. Kalau ingin supaya tidak terjadi efek yang terlalu ekstrim terhadap perubahan fisiologis tubuhnya, ya, 5% itu sudah cukup bagus dari kondisi awal. Jadi kalau kemudian lebih dari itu akan harus ada penyesuaian yang kemudian mungkin akan ada efek-efek kejutan buat yang bersangkutan. Saya rasa begitu.
Ya, baik. Terima kasih, Prof. Itu tadi penjelasannya bahwa kita perlu memperhatikan jangan sampai ada faktor lain yang menyebabkan penurunan berat badan secara drastis dan kemungkinan penurunannya itu 5% ya, Prof ya. Baik, the last but not least ini pertanyaan dari rekan dosen kami juga, Ibu Arimbi. Izin bertanya, Prof. Bagaimana hubungannya dengan sistem energi? Bukankah sistem energi aerobik yang menghasilkan bioenergi paling besar daripada sistem energi anaerobik? Terkait mioglobin akan berhubungan dengan jumlah mitokondria dalam setiap sel. Sedangkan jumlah mitokondria dalam setiap sel yang berbeda antar setiap organ dan antar individu yang dipengaruhi gen. Lantas, apakah metode latihan intensitas tinggi ini dapat digeneralisasi pada semua individu? Apakah ditangkap poinnya, Prof, atau mesti saya coba ulangi?
Atau mungkin yang bersangkutan bisa muncul di
Oh,
ini lebih banyak.
oke.
Kalau
Kita coba.
berkenan.
Iya.
Kita undang ya.
Oh, sepertinya sudah tidak ini ya.
Bu dosen.
Kita coba cari dulu. Apakah masih bergabung di Zoom?
Kan
Oh,
harus
masih.
bahasa Inggris kan rekan.
Oke. Ibu Arimbi, siapa tahu bisa menyampaikan
Bergabung.
pertanyaan secara langsung. Apakah sudah bergabung?
Ya, Assalamualaikum Prof. Mohon maaf.
Waalaikumsalam.
Iya.
Enggak
Saya
apa-apa.
dari tadi saya mendengar materinya Prof. Saya tertarik sekali Prof dengan pemaparan yang
Ya.
barusan, apalagi ini sudah berdasarkan dari meta analisis berbagai penelitian yang sudah dilakukan. Cuman yang agak mungkin belum terlalu clear buat saya, bagaimana dengan metode sistem energi? Bagaimana kalau dihubungkan dengan sistem energi? Bukankah selama ini teori yang sudah ada kita ketahui bahwa bioenergi yang dihasilkan dalam metode aerobik itu selalu lebih besar daripada anaerobik. Sedangkan kalau HIIT yang mengutamakan anaerobik memang intensitas latihannya tinggi, tapi kan untuk seperti disampaikan oleh Prof juga bahwa bukan ambilan oksigen pada saat kita beraktivitas yang langsung digunakan untuk membakar energi, tetapi yang sudah ada sediaannya di tingkat sel. Nah, kemudian mioglobin yang ada di tingkat sel itu akan dihubungkan, akan memang saling berhubungan dengan jumlah mitokondria. Mitokondria ini tentu akan berbeda jumlahnya dari setiap organ, setiap individu. Maksud saya, mitokondria di otot itu pasti akan berbeda dengan di jantung, di otak, dan otot pun itu akan berbeda lagi. Orang yang dengan tipe otot cepat, itu jumlah mitokondrianya akan lebih sedikit daripada orang yang punya otot lambat.
Betul.
Nah, sekarang bagaimana Prof menurut Prof? Apakah ini HIIT? Itu kan ditentukan oleh genetik ya Prof ya. Nah, sekarang apakah benar ini HIIT memang bisa digeneralisasi? Artinya tidak ada pertimbangan-pertimbangan tertentu untuk diberlakukan pada setiap individu, terlepas tentu dari riwayat-riwayat penyakit. Begitu Prof.
Ya,
mohon arahan.
Terima kasih.
Ya Prof.
Ya, saya coba jelaskannya. Begini, ada satu yang tadi terlewat ya, belum dijelaskan. Mungkin bisa ditampilkan lagi slide-nya supaya nanti clear ya. Jadi memang betul setiap organ, setiap sel memiliki kadar mioglobin yang berbeda. Betul. Justru karena itu proses metabolik lemak atau fat burn itu tidak terjadi di semua organ, tidak terjadi di semua sel, gitu ya. Jadi sel-sel yang memiliki banyak mitokondria, coba yang mendekati akhir, slide yang ada tadi mendekati akhir, bisa ditunjukkan. Yang ada gambar jantung, di dalamnya ada lipid droplets-nya tadi. Terus agak akhir, dekat sama akhir. Nah itu tadi sebelum. Nah ini sebelum. Nah ini ya. Nah, makasih. Ini saya jelaskan tadi kelewat. Jadi saya ulang ya. Jadi tidak semua organ, tidak semua sel itu menjadi metabolic organ, tidak menjadi tempat fat burn. Tidak semua. Dan tidak semua tempat itu, tidak semua organ itu mengalami timbunan lipid droplet, tidak semua. Maka dari itu yang sering kita dengar itu kan fatty liver, fatty heart, ya, kardiomiopati, gitu kan. Jadi untuk yang organ yang lain tidak. Kenapa? Ya kaitannya dengan jumlah mitokondria. Nah, satu hal yang kemudian penting juga untuk diketahui adalah bahwa jumlah asam lemak yang diterima oleh setiap organ, setiap sel itu berbeda. Bergantung kepada kemampuan sel untuk memetabolisme lemak. Bergantung kepada kadar mioglobin yang dimiliki oleh sel itu. Nah, asam lemak yang dimobilisasi melalui darah itu akan diambil oleh sel melalui satu protein transport yang disebut dengan CD36. Pada slide ini ada, perhatikan ya. Ada CD36. CD36 ini yang mengatur jumlah asam lemak yang dimasukkan ke dalam sel untuk di metabolisme atau di burn. Semakin banyak mitokondrianya, semakin tinggi mioglobinnya, maka CD36-nya juga semakin tinggi. Jadi kalau tadi ditanya apakah efeknya sama setiap organ? Enggak ya, tergantung dari jumlah CD36-nya, jumlah mioglobinnya, dan jumlah mitokondrianya. Gitu ya, bisa dipahami ya. Nah, pertanyaannya apakah sama setiap orang? Pasti beda. Pasti beda. Sangat bergantung kepada kapasitas aerobik orang tersebut. Kalau orang itu memiliki dasar kapasitas aerobik yang bagus, maka dia akan memberikan respon terhadap hasil exercise yang high intensity exercise itu semakin bagus juga. Itu tadi yang ditanyakan oleh coach tadi. Jadi sebelum melakukan semua aktivitas high intensity exercise, pastikan bahwa kita memiliki dasar oksidatif yang bagus. Kalau enggak, maka resikonya tadi dibongkar saja dari subcutaneous fat, dibawa ke visceral organ, dan ternyata visceral organnya tidak memiliki mioglobin yang cukup banyak. Akhirnya numpuk di sana, enggak di burn, karena kapasitas aerobiknya terbatas. Nah, ini yang kemudian kita perlu pahami bersama. Jadi kalau mau noto, menatanya itu adalah mulai young, mulai teenage. Jadi kalau sekarang punya anak-anak, nah anak-anaknya dipastikan mereka memiliki kapasitas aerobik yang bagus. Sehingga pada suatu saat ketika mereka itu mendapatkan porsi latihan high intensity exercise, bisa berdampak kepada lemaknya. Fat burn-nya itu menjadi nyata, jadi tidak hanya di PHP. Di situ kuncinya, di situ ya. Jadi high intensity exercise ini bagaimana kemudian bisa berdampak mengurangi fat mass, itu sangat bergantung kepada kapasitas aerobik setiap orang. Semakin bagus kapasitas aerobiknya, maka dampaknya akan semakin bagus. Karena itu kalau kapasitas aerobiknya kurang bagus, saya sarankan sesekali saja HIIE. Tujuannya adalah untuk membakar yang ada di visceral. Tapi kalau high intensity interval training dalam jangka waktu yang lama, saya khawatir malah justru akan numpuk lipid droplet di visceral organ. Meskipun orangnya sudah turun berat badannya, ya, sudah ideal berat badannya, tapi di dalam kalau diperiksa, wah, menyimpan banyak masalah. Mas Reza, masih mute?
Siap. Iya. Terima kasih Prof. Bambang atas jawaban yang sudah disampaikan secara langsung. Tadi poin yang utama yang saya dengarkan bahwa di masa remaja itu adalah masa yang sangat tepat untuk memberikan exercise karena itu akan menjadi semacam investasi supaya setiap orang itu punya kemampuan pembakaran lemak yang bagus di usia selanjutnya. Baik, terima kasih banyak Prof. Bambang Purwanto atas kesempatannya. Saya pikir dengan berakhirnya tadi penjelasan dari apa yang ditanyakan Ibu Arimbi, itu sudah menjadi bagian dari akhir semua sesi kita pada kesempatan hari ini. Terima kasih sekali lagi kami ucapkan kepada Profesor Dr. Bambang Purwanto, MKes. Untuk itu, dengan segala hormat kami memberikan sertifikat sebagai bentuk terima kasih atas perkenannya Prof membawakan materi yang luar biasa pada kesempatan hari ini. Sertifikat, this certificate is proudly award to Prof. Dr. Bambang Purwanto, MKes, as a keynote speaker in International Webinar in Sports Science Series 2, Sport Nutrition for Health and Performance, on May 27 on 2023, organized by the Faculty of Sports Science and Health, Universitas Negeri Makassar. One more time, thanks to Professor Stephen Francis Barnes, PhD, to join in our webinar. Nice to meet you. We hope we can meet in our webinar in next time. Oke, terima kasih untuk seluruh partisipan yang sudah bergabung pada kesempatan hari ini. Kami menyaksikan ada banyak sekali peserta yang sudah bergabung. Di link ini ada 155 dan di YouTube juga ada sekitar 150-an juga yang bergabung. Oleh karena itu menjadi hal yang sangat menggembirakan bagi kami sebagai pelaksana. Ada peserta yang berasal dari Surabaya, dari Purwokerto, dan beberapa daerah dari Papua juga, dan beberapa daerah yang ada di Indonesia. Mohon maaf atas segala hal yang kurang dari kami. Semoga bisa menjadi pembelajaran bagi kami untuk meningkatkan kemampuan kami di seri webinar berikutnya. Terima kasih. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Oke, yang terakhir jangan lupa para peserta untuk mengisi absensi yang sudah kami kirimkan di kolom chat. Terima kasih.
Terima kasih. Saya izin live ya, Mas Reza dan semua panitia.
Matur
Terima
suwun
kasih.
sangat, Prof.
Sehat-sehat semua.
Terima kasih, Prof.
Assalamualaikum.
Waalaikumsalam.
Waalaikumsalam.
Thank you.
Thank you, Prof.
Thank you, Prof. Thank you,
Stephen
Stephen.
Francis Barnes.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye for now. Thank you.
Bye-bye.